good afternoon to those of you in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and good evening or night for those of you who are joining from Asia Pacific. And a very warm welcome to all of you who are in this Zoom meeting, as well as those of you who will be following the live stream on Facebook, and some who will actually be watching asynchronously when we post this video online, I believe on YouTube. To introduce myself, my name is Anji Manivannan. I am WFM-IGP's Director of Programs, and I have the honor of emceeing this event and moderating the second session. We have a great lineup of sessions and speakers ranging from democracy and governance, rule of law and international frameworks, and environmental justice. So without further ado, let me introduce WFM-IGP's new Consulting Executive Director, Sandra Coyle. Sandra Coyle joined us in January of this year and is driving the strategic direction, funding, and structure of the organization. Please join me with the reactions buttons in welcoming Sandra. Over to you.
Thank you, Anji, and everyone. Great to see some faces that I've met over the past 6 or 7 weeks and some new faces. I really appreciate the warm welcome, and I'd like to give a welcome to all of our esteemed panelists for joining us today for this very important discussion. I am really thrilled to join the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy at this very important time in history. And at this time of rapid change globally, I really believe there is a larger role for the organization and its networks to play to influence the course of history. As I mentioned in January, I've had the opportunity to speak with many past, current, and hopefully future supporters of the movement around the world. It has been an informative exercise for me, as I am not only new to the organization, but also to the movement. I look forward to continuing the discussion today and sharing my proposed plans for the future of the organization. I think what we'll do is if you have any questions for me, I'm more than happy to answer them, but we'll wait till the end of this conference today. Thank you, Anji. Back over to you.
So Sandra, thank you again for the brief introduction. I'm very happy to have you and to have been working with you for the past nearly 2 months now. I think it would be maybe interesting to just share a little bit about your interests specifically in WFM-IGP and how you ended up here.
Sure. I think what caught my attention with WFM-IGP is that I've been working within the international development space for about 20 years, and I had not heard about the organization. And given the situation the whole world went through in the past year or so with coronavirus and the difficulties that national governments had in coordinating their own responses, I saw a need more for a global approach to global solutions, and really WFM-IGP provides the answer for that. So I was keen to join and help really build the visibility of the movement and the organization. So a lot of the calls, and if I have not spoken with you and you'd like to speak with me, please do feel free to reach out to me after this conference. It's a way for me to understand the incredible history of the organization, but where we can be more impactful for the future.
Thank you for that. I think we'll, in order to kind of keep time, which is a little bit more important when you're in the digital sphere, we'll move over to the first session. So I will be sharing the moderating role of the sessions with Peter López. Peter is known to some of you as our Congress chair as well, and has been involved in this movement for quite some time. And I think we'll be able to speak to the issues on the democracy panel, which is session 1, and then also on environmental justice. So let me hand it over to Peter to take that session forward.
Thank you very much, Anji. Welcome to everybody. I think this is a most important session. As Anji said, we had a conference last year, which was really well attended. And I'm pleased this one is going to get down to even more critical details about where we're going and what we're trying to do. Now, I don't think I'm saying anything terribly novel by saying 2 things are happening at the moment in our world. One is that we have never needed more to get together to deal with critical problems. The pandemic has been one, but right on the horizon, of course, and coming closer, in fact, it's already with us, is the environmental issue. We've also got a number of other issues, key issues, to do with nuclear disarmament, to do with a variety of major problems facing our globe, and yet at the same time, we are facing a rising of nationalism and populism around the world. And so this first session, I think, is very well placed to look at some of those key issues, how democracy integrates supranational governance. And we couldn't have two better speakers to start this session. The two speakers, I'm going to introduce them both first and then let them speak for about 10 minutes each and then invite questions and discussion. The first is Camila López Badra, who is the executive director of the NGO Democracia Global. She is the coordinator of the campaign for the creation of a Latin American and Caribbean criminal court against transnational organized crime, COPLA, which emerged from the NGO Democracia Global. Simultaneously, she is also parliamentary advisor in the Chamber of Deputies of the Argentine Republic, and very excitingly, she's a tango teacher. So if I ever have the chance, I shall ask her when we have time to get together to teach me this wonderful dance. And following her will be Andreas Bummel, who is co-founder and director of Democracy Without Borders and of the International Campaign for a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, UNPA. Many of you will be familiar with this campaign. Since 1998, Andreas was a member of the Council of the World Federalist Movement, and in 2018, he authored a major book on the history, relevance, and implementation of a world parliament, co-authored with Joe Linen, familiar to many of you. It's titled A World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century, and is an absolutely critical book for all Federalists. So if I may pass on first to Camila.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. I'm super happy that we can share this conference together. And of course, if we have time in another conference where we can meet each other, I can teach you tango. So for today, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, governmental authority must rest on the will of the people, and this will be expressed in periodic and free elections. There is no reason why this should not apply globally as well. Since 2007, the International Day of Democracy has been celebrated, and the need for the UN General Assembly to have established a day of commemoration is given by the fact that although it is one of the basic values and principles of the United Nations and a means for the protection of human rights, the global democracy is not included in the Charter of the United Nations. The strengthening of parliaments is promoted for greater control of abuses of powers by executives. The civil society, like us, will contribute to the governance, accountability, and transparency of governments. UN Secretary Guterres said a few months ago that a new model of global governance must be based on full, inclusive, and equal participation in global institutions. Let's build a global democracy in which a world parliament creates a transparent and interconnected global healthcare system, establish mandatory early warning standards and protocols in the event of potential pandemics. Federal democratic global governance means strengthening the capacities of the global judiciary and parliamentary power that already exist in an embryonic state. An international criminal court to sanction governments and rulers for genocide and war crimes, but also for not complying with the coronavirus control protocols. A UN Parliamentary Assembly whose directives must be limited to critical global problems such as pandemics, climate change, financial stability, artificial intelligence, and nuclear disarmament. Its creation represents a practical and feasible step on the road to a world parliament. The role of the young people to build a world federalism, I think, should be a priority. There are 1.8 billion people worldwide, the largest generation the world has ever known. Young people are 24% of our population, but they are 100% of our future. It is the WFM duty to bring them hope and give them the opportunity to act. Young people are aware of the complexity of today's world, and they want to change it. They don't want to be merely participants. They want to be change makers. They are protagonists in the fight for their rights and their well-being. They know that all local problems have an impact on the global level. At the same time, all problems of global magnitude manifest themselves in some way at the local level. It has among its priorities to seek ways to respond and find solutions in a fair, responsible, and equitable way to problems of many kinds, such as inequality, lack of opportunity, corruption, poverty, and climate change. Young people want to change the current situation, but not all of them know how to go for it. Here is where the World Federalist movement has an opportunity. By approaching young people, it could be the platform, the collective actor that they need. If they are part of a huge movement, they can feel empowered, they can feel transformed, they can feel that they are making a contribution to society. They can be part of a movement that shares the same worries, but also the same values as them. The strategies. Communication is a key. We do not have to take it for granted. There is a need to build communication plan, and it should be related to the demands that young people are asking for to address the needs of those that are seeking a change. With a user-friendly website and active appealing social media accounts, the WFM could spread its message and connect and emphasize people with the connect of the World Federation. Create campaigns or initiatives that specially focus on the demand of young people, and build a network with those organizations made up for young people around the world. And I have to say that Daniel from Australia is doing a great work on this. Most young people already feel like global citizens. So global citizenship has clear objectives, despite the fact that it's always evolving. Although it seems obvious, it is worth repeating and emphasizing that global citizenship does not take into account geographical distinctions and goes beyond the power or governments that are specific to each country. It is important to note that global citizenship does not eliminate or reject the concept of nationality. What changed is that it increased the social, political, economic actions taken by individuals, and it ceases to be independent from where the individual is. These actions are taken with a thought for the global impact they might have. The transnational perspective is a fundamental component in its definition, as is in inviting multiple actors to participate in decision making. So what does it mean to be a global citizen? It is to understand that the human condition is above borders or territorial barriers. It is a way of life that recognizes that our world is an increasingly complex web of connections and interdependencies. It is understanding that our choice and actions can have repercussions for people and communities at the local, national, and international level. Technology, the media and social network allow the global citizen to have the knowledge to be involved in what happens around the world. The transnational perspective is then a fundamental axis in this definition of global citizenship, because it is only through this perspective that we will be able to face issues for a global nature. The concept of global citizenship is embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of its main missions is to protect human dignity, promote the defense of human rights, increase tolerance, inclusion, and give more space to diversity. Defining a global citizen is not an easy task. However, when we put it together in reality into daily practice, we see how this definition comes out naturally for millions of people. As the current United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, indicates, global citizenship is a new and vital force which seeks in practice to reflect the great plurality of actors that today are engaged in global actions that affect all citizens of the world. We should promote education that help young people understand the global issues that affect their lives and take action through a more just and sustainable world. About this, I would like to highlight the World Parliament experiment held by Democracy Without Borders. There is a voting platform. The aim for this is to connect up global citizens to debate and vote on proposals to improve our global political system. Also, in this sense, Democracia Global has been working since 2019 on the realization of UNP models around the world. The basis to carry out these models is to raise awareness on the need for global democratic institutions capable of tackling and finding solutions for global issues that cannot be solved unilaterally by individual nation states. We encourage its participants to put themselves in the shoes of a member of parliament representing the citizens of the world without being tied to specific political parties or countries, and working together on a drafting of viable and effective proposals for tackling these global issues that know no borders and therefore requires global solutions. The first was held in Buenos Aires at the Senate of Argentina with great success. The second will be held in September online with students from India. And of course, we invite you to do the same in your country and your university. About global governance and campaigns to be aware of the importance of international institutions, the world is currently going through an unprecedented crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the violation of the rule of law. Authoritarian measures are justified from the health crisis, so that the democratic system that was already in crisis is disputed. There are no transparent global mechanisms for the early detection and control of pandemics, and there are no mandatory protocols that everyone must respect in defense of a planetary common good, the survival of humanity. In 2010, we launched the Manifesto for Global Democracy. You can check it in globaldemocracymanifesto.wordpress.com. This document stated that the profound technological and economic transformation did not correspond to the similar evolution of the public institution. The economy has gone global, but political institutions of democracy have not, with their many peculiarities, differences, and limitations. The protests, they are spreading across the planet. They show a growing disconnect with the decision-making system, the existing forms of representation, their limited capacity to protect the common good of the political system and express a demand for more and better democracy. Unfortunately, little has been done in the sense of what we propose, and the world has gone rather in the opposite direction. Today, the dramatic crisis caused by the coronavirus shows the accuracy of that diagnosis and the need to resume the initiative, or at least try to stop the nationalist populist wave that will try to take advantage of this opportunity to advance its threats to multilateralism, peace, and democracy. We need to strengthen the existing weak international structure, starting with the World Health Organization and continuing through the entire UN. It is important too that the principles of democracy and federalism that we consider essential at the national level begin to be applied worldwide. It is time for global institutions to be equipped with the power they need. They confront global threats and manage global commons such as public health, climate action, sustainable development, and peace, for example. We believe that the national autonomy of state is best served by strengthening the rule of international law and collective security. That is why I invite you to sign or disseminate the document on global governance and the coronavirus. It has already been signed by several of those who accompanied us at the original document more than 8 years ago. You can join us in globaldemocracy.wixsite.com/COVID-19. So perhaps the coronavirus pandemic has taught us how small the Earth is and how close we are to each other. I hope you understand me in English. So
that's
thank
a
you,
tremendous
Peter.
point. Thank you very much indeed. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you for a really excellent introduction. Andreas, may I pass on to yourself?
Thank you very much first to Angie for starting this session, and to Peter for the nice introduction. And of course, Sandra, welcome on board in the World Federalist family. And I think we all look very much forward working with you. In my presentation, I will focus on the critical relevance of democracy in a World Federalist approach. I will argue that world federalism and democracy are inseparable. I will make the point that the success of world federalism in the long run depends on the success and further advancement of democracy. For this reason, world federalists need to be alarmed about the current crisis of democracy. In my opinion, strengthening and defending democracy needs to be a key focus of World Federalist action. I would first like to use this opportunity, for those who are not necessarily familiar with it, to say a few words about what World Federalism means, since the potential of a World Federalist approach is the overarching theme of this conference. In my view, World Federalism essentially means that government authority should be distributed across all levels of government, from the local to the global, so that public affairs can be managed in the best possible way. The yardstick for doing so is the principle of subsidiarity. At any given level, government authority should only perform such tasks that cannot be performed efficiently at a more local level. Now, World Federalists are preoccupied with the fact that at the level above the nation state, there is hardly any government authority at all. There are now 193 states recognized as members of the United Nations that under international law are all considered sovereign. By definition, this excludes a higher authority. With the exception perhaps of the European Union, political integration in the world's region is moving forward at a very slow pace. In the area of trade, certainly a lot is going on, but this is not the same as political integration. Now, World Federalists argue that global collaboration between nation states is inefficient and fails to provide critical global public goods, such as sustainability, peace and security, or social justice. The failure to reduce global carbon emissions over the course of the past 30 years is a prominent example that can be put forward, and there are many others. In this connection, we can speak of a governance gap at the global level, and World Federalists are looking into strategies as how to fill this gap. This governance gap goes along with a democratic gap, as the agenda setting and decision-making above the nation state, insofar as it exists, is usually exclusively in the realm of the executive branch of governments. And now, if time allows, I would like to show one slide that makes it clear what I am talking about. So where are we here? Right. So you can see on this slide 3 columns and different levels. The columns, they describe the level of parliamentary representation that exists. The other middle column describes political governance and decision-making that exists. And the very right column describes issues that need to be managed at the top global common goods, global public goods. So what we have is a situation that at the level above the nation state, there is only limited parliamentary representation. At the level of political governance, there is only limited ways of collaboration at the international level, and virtually no at the global scale. But this corresponds with the fact that issues and challenges that need to be dealt with are completely planetary and global in scale in many cases. And all of this is even more complicated because there are only like 115 electoral democracies, and 55 countries, according to the Fragile States Index, are on a high warning status or worse, which means they are even at the national level hardly capable of delivering common goods that are considered, you know, important at this stage. So let me stop screen sharing again, and let me continue with my narrative, because all of this brings us to the concept of supranational governance that is highlighted in the title of this panel. The key notion of world federalism is that nation states would voluntarily transfer part of their sovereignty to a new global organization. A supranational organization is an entity that can take decisions that automatically bind its component parts, which then would be the nation states. In this regard, federalism is inherently democratic because it accepts that these component parts of any federal system need to have sufficient leeway to deal with affairs on their own that do not affect the whole without the interference of the top-level government authority. And now, this is a crucial point. It is hard to imagine that a state unit under control of an autocratic government would be able and willing to participate in supranational integration, as I just described. Autocracies do not accept the sovereignty and rights even of their own people, and they will not accept transferring real powers anywhere else. Even if they did, this would create fierce tensions and conflicts at the level of decision-making, implementation, principles, and identity, amongst others, in the larger scale unit. The European integration project, for instance, was exclusively driven by states under democratic government. Recent democratic backsliding in Poland and Hungary are putting the EU's value system and functioning under big pressure. Democratic backsliding and rising nationalistic ambitions in Turkey are also creating tensions in NATO as a military alliance. Another important example for us world federalists can be found at the time of the Second World War. At the US State Department, there was a team that was looking into the post-war order, and they considered the option of the creation of an international federal government. This team at the US State Department came to the conclusion that this path was not doable with the Soviet Union, and I quote, even if it were theoretically desirable. The obstacle here obviously was the totalitarian character of the Soviet Union at the time. Recent research suggests that authoritarian states are much less likely to engage in publicly reported treaty making compared to democracies. As a general rule, they do not participate in the international legal order to the same degree. In parts, I think one can say that the crisis of multilateralism is also a crisis of democracy. In addition, authoritarian government contradicts the notion of citizenship per se, as the latter implies political and civil rights. The concept of global citizenship that Camila also talked about cannot be realized in a global order that includes major authoritarian states. Conceptually, the power and democratic legitimation of a federal world state emanates from two things. First, civic legitimation based on individual citizens, and second, state legitimation based on the will of all states as component parts. In autocratic states, obviously, civic legitimation cannot be expressed in proper ways. Bypassing states, as some imagine, is no viable strategy, because with the exception of failed states, or fragile states perhaps, it is them who control taxation, redistribution, law enforcement, and military power, among other things, in a given territory. In conclusion, without democracy thriving at the level of nation states, a democratic world federation based on global citizenship and universal world law, in my opinion, is not possible. National and global democratization are interlinked. For this reason, we must be very concerned about what is called a new wave of autocratization that is ongoing. For the first time since 2001, a majority of all states worldwide is no longer under democratic rule. This was one of the key findings of last year's report of the Varieties of Democracy project. The latest report of the Economist Intelligence Unit on the development of democracy, published just a few weeks ago, marked the lowest overall score in the index of democracy since it was started in 2006. In 2020, the democracy scores of 116 countries declined, with only 38 improving and the other 13 stagnating. Now, in many hybrid and authoritarian regimes, rulers took advantage of the pandemic in order to suppress dissent, subdue political opponents, and further strengthen their grip on power. There is an upside because researchers also register an all-time high in pro-democracy and civic protests around the world in more than 60 countries. Surveys also show that people are not dissatisfied with democracy as an ideal form of government, but they are dissatisfied with how democracy operates in practice. So I think there is an opportunity for world federalists to connect to pro-democratic movements across the world. And this is exactly what Democracy Without Borders is trying to do. Of course, democratization at the nation state level is not enough. The slide that I showed illustrates that even if all countries become democratic, the governance and democracy gaps will persist, and they will continue to undermine trust in political institutions. So in this connection, we promote our key project, the UN Parliamentary Assembly, not only as a tool to democratize the UN, but also as a body that will help strengthen democracy at the national level. It is clear, to conclude my presentation, it is clear that urgent global action is required right now in dealing with critical global challenges, and there is no time to wait until all states are democratic. Nonetheless, in the meantime, I think we should have no illusions about the prospects of global supranational integration and the transformation of the UN in this sense. Democratization will need to come first. A final word perhaps about the idea of closer collaboration of democracies that is in the air, because US President Joe Biden pledged that he would convene a summit of democracies in his first year in office. Of course, from my point of view, it is absolutely worthwhile to look into this very closely. Obviously, as democracy is under pressure internally and externally, more needs to be done in this field. A club of democracies can be important to strengthen democracy at various levels, including at the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Looking forward to our discussion.
Absolutely. It's going to be open for discussion, and I'll be grateful when they want to ask a question or make a comment, people could put up their electronic hands. It's very important that I can see who is going to be asking a question. Before we do that, though, I have my own question, which I may kick off with Andreas and Camila. The very important words, democracy, the other word is values, which comes into it. Now, like many people, maybe a few others on this webinar, I was a child of the 60s, growing up at a time when I thought youth values across the world were getting very similar. You know, we'd be thinking in the same kind of way about democracy, about anti-racism, about moving things forward. We shared a lot of musical tastes, a lot of fashionable tastes. But what happened was gradually people went back into the values with which they grew up. Now, as Camila said, there are, I think it is 24% of the world is young, under 25. Do you think that social media is going to be able to get some kind of unity of values, which comes, it seems to me, very importantly when one's talking about democracy? Or do you think it will have the opposite effect to increase sort of populism and nationalism? Whilst those questions are being answered, I can see some hands going up. That's great. So may I ask Andreas? I can't see you, Camila. Are you still with us? Camila?
Peter, can you hear me?
Great. Did you hear my question?
Yes, I'm here, but my internet is not working very well.
Okay. Well, look, I don't know if you heard the question, but let me ask Andreas to start, though, if you could, with the answer about whether the new...
Can you repeat the question? I think it's something about young and
it's whether
media?
the new social media will encourage a communality of values among young people, or would it in fact do the opposite and encourage populism and nationalism? So
Right.
to kick off, Andreas.
Perhaps, as you suggest, I can respond to this. I think that the internet and social media, and we are now wiser than we were a couple of years ago, actually strengthens existing values, as there is a tendency, obviously, that information bubbles come up. So you would tend to interact basically with people who share your values, whatever these values are. And of course, we have seen that although the internet and social media does allow for excellent cross-border collaboration for progressive aims, I mean, what we would consider progressive, it just the same has helped right-wing and nationalistic forces to collaborate better as well, and conspiracy theorists and so on, and up to the point that in Myanmar, Facebook was instrumental in pushing forward the genocide. You know, so I think there is a mixed situation right now, and for sure, if you want to put it into a nutshell, the internet has not kept up with the promise of creating some global democratic space, as you know, the idea was at the beginning, perhaps in the late 90s. This is no longer the case, and this really calls for regulation in this field. So yes, I think the utopia of, you know, a shared progressive values pushed forward by the internet, this has not happened.
Thank you. Camila. Camila, can you hear me? All right? Okay, we'll wait. I think Camilla's having problems of actually getting the sound working. So I'll move on to some questions. I can see 3 hands up. Lucio, can I ask people, oh, and Guido, Lucio, Guido, James, and Jared. Can you keep your comments or questions to within 2 minutes, please? Lucio.
Yes, thank you. I share the presentation by Andreas Bummel, and would like to add a short additional remark. I think that we, the World Federalists, should learn the lesson of the European Union, which is the first example of democracy beyond national borders. The EU is the laboratory of a new form of statehood based on democratization and constitutionalization of the international relations. The European Parliament is the first elected supranational parliament in history. It can be conceived as the first step on the way of global democracy. So it can play the role of a model for UN reform. Secondly, there is a premise of international democracy, that is interdependence, the formation of economic and social interdependence between the national economies and societies. So I think that the United Nations should build the international democracy, global parliament on the basis of the globalization process, which is an economic and social process of integration worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucio. Guido.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Let me make a comment about Bummel's idea of supranational governance. Of course, I agree on that as a goal, as a general goal of a federalist. But there is a previous step, a preliminary step, which let me say it is global governance. Global governance is, according to me, but and many other people, it is a situation, a a framework in which great power are set to cooperate peacefully among them. So it is a situation in which you don't need a big reform, but only to eliminate the nationalist attempt to prevail on other states. So that is global governance. Let me make an example. We are going toward the conference in Glasgow for the COP26. If we achieve an agreement among the main great power, like United States, China, Russia, European Union, UK, and so on, that is a contribution to international democracy or not? According to me, it is a step forward very important, because if great power start to cooperate among them, you make a step forward toward global democracy and global supranational institutions. I stop here.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm getting feedback here. I don't know why. I'm getting very bad. Anyway, I've got Jared's hand up. Are there any other questions? If people could put their electronic hands up, then I can give them time to prepare their questions. Okay, well, Jared, I pass on to you.
Hi, thank you for opening up this conference. It's my first time actually joining. I'm calling in from Tempe, Arizona. I'm a student at ASU, and I'm a student of philosophy and political science. And one thing that I've noticed in my studies is, especially with the rise of populist nationalism in the past couple decades, is that democracy has essentially fundamentally enabled populist nationalistic trends. And this question is to Andreas Bummel, actually. In light of the multitude of cultures around the world and the common problem with weak states that are trying to democratize due to their failure of compatibility with the cultural values with democratic principles, how would democratizing or turning the UN into a parliament rectify essentially a cultural gap on the global level to reinforce the very much needed global governance through world government if there's a discrepancy in the cultural values in various regions through the establishment of a parliamentary assembly in the UN?
Andreas, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, right. First of all, I would like to agree with Guido, of course, that there are preliminary steps that need to be taken and pushed forward below the threshold of supranational integration. I think that's quite clear. And as I said, we cannot wait for our states to become democratic. We have urgent issues right now on the agenda. So yes, global governance and whatever it involves needs to be pushed forward as best as possible. And here's really a tension between promoting human rights and democracy and the need to keep open a dialogue and collaboration with such countries that are gross human rights abusers, including China. So this is really something we need to maneuver, collaborating and at the same time, flagging that we are aware of this, this tension and situation. In terms of cultural, I'm not sure I understood the question, in terms of cultural uniformity or shared values as a precondition for democratizing the UN, I would argue that, institutionally, the UN itself has over decades promoted democracy as it is defined in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Camila has mentioned the International Day of Democracy that has been introduced by the UN General Assembly. So at the formal level, there is really no dissent that democracy is something, you know, that is inbuilt into the cultural and value system of the UN. Of course, we know this is in many cases that's not really true, because we have many UN member states that are gross human rights violators. But at the institutional level, they would hardly be able to say they oppose democracy. And I think the big value of a UN Parliamentary Assembly really would be on that basis to provide a common platform for differing voices that at this time do not have sufficient opportunity to make themselves heard at the UN. So on the other hand, I believe that there is a very basic set of global, universal, common values that such a body can draw upon. But nonetheless, I think this is more relevant at the stage when we would consider giving such a body real competences. At the initial stage where a parliamentary assembly would be largely consultative, I do not see this to be much of an issue. I'm not sure whether I actually got to the point of your question.
Thank you, Andreas. Now, a couple of points. One is, I think we've lost Camila for the time being. So I can't see any more electronic hands up at the moment, but please do put them up if you have a comment or a question. Meanwhile, Andreas, I'd like to come back to you on something. We've talked about autocracies and populism and so on. There are also countries that are theocracies that actually do not accept the fundamental democratic principles that some others do accept. There has always been a notion that maybe one ought to begin with bringing the world's democracies together and working from that. Could you make comments on what you feel about that?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, perhaps a note only that according to surveys that are serious and representative, empirical surveys across world regions, majorities, even in countries like Iran, they do support civic rights and political rights. I would argue that the big obstacle that we have is really the elites who do not want these rights to come to fruition in their countries. But otherwise, yes, I mean, as I mentioned in the very last words of my presentation, I think it is really worthwhile to look into the closer collaboration of democracies. Of course, we have within our WFM, and it's officially supported by a resolution, the campaign to bring together OECD, NATO, and the World Security Community. And Chris Hamer, I saw him here, he is. He's leading that effort. And I mean, like I say, I think we need to try all routes. But eventually, if we talk about binding world law and the World Federation, all of this will have to culminate in a transformation of the UN. And here, one way or another, there is the precondition that at least all major countries will have to be democratic. And I do not think that having a parallel UN makes sense. I think it makes sense to have a community that brings together democracies. So they look not only at promoting democracy abroad, but also look at how can they strengthen democracy at home, right? So also internally, and it's been mentioned by Jared, isn't it, that democratic instruments have been used by misused perhaps by populist and nationalist sentiments, like the instrument of a referendum to actually, you know, push forward nationalist agendas. But I mean, to a degree, I have to say this is something that is inbuilt into democracy. I mean, there might be movements and parties and people who win the vote who we do not like. That's something we need to accept. And it becomes, of course, problematic if such majorities then try to abolish democracy, as often happens. So to sum up, I think that a club of democracies is important, but the devil is in the details. How exactly would it look like? And it's not yet clear what Biden is planning to do with his summit of democracies. But we have our campaign here, and which is most forward-looking here. As far as I'm concerned, I would be looking at smaller scale preliminary steps like an expanded G7 based on democratic values, for instance, like it is promoted by the UK. However, one that would include the EU. This is something that's important.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Keith and then James. Keith, over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to try to address the issue that Jared rose about culture, because that is very important. And I think also we need to be very critical about democracy. I mean, democracy is not always what it cracks up to be. And indeed, many of you will recall that a generation ago, Churchill quoted in the House of Commons that democracy is the most inefficient form of government and only gains credence once you start looking at other forms of government. So democracy is flawed, inherently flawed, but it is the best available option. And the ancient Greeks found that, and that's where it all emanated from. So we are dealing with a flawed system, but one nevertheless that is better than autocracy or other forms of government. But I want to draw the analogy on culture with human rights. And I think it's very interesting. If you look at the way in which human rights have developed, again, coming from very, very different cultural backgrounds, one can argue that the formulation of the Universal Declaration and other human rights instruments are very much a creation of the Judeo-Christian ethic, but they have become universal. And that is notwithstanding a very considerable difference in attitude towards human rights in the West, which is in the North much more geared to individual human rights, whereas you look more to the East and you see collectivism, collective human rights seem to have a higher priority than individual rights. And I think one can argue that is what we are seeing a manifestation of in China at the present time. Yet over the years since the Universal Declaration, notwithstanding attempts by people like Mr. Mahathir, when he was Prime Minister of Malaysia for the first time, trying to make it clear that as far as he was concerned, human rights were a Western invention and a neo-colonialist imposition on the rest of the world. That argument has largely been discounted, and the secular nature and the universality of human rights is now accepted around the world. So let me just translate that briefly into the concept of democracy. And again, going back to the fact that it is a flawed system, but nevertheless the best one around because it gives voice to the people. It is, I think, our experience that when parliamentarians come together, even if they are from origins, states where democracy is practiced in a very different way. I mean, in the West, we are used to plural democracy. In Africa, there are many still one-party states where you have to be a member of the party in order to be a member of parliament. Yet, when you get those people coming together, whether through the IPU or other parliamentary assemblies, and they discuss things amongst each other, there is a process of osmosis. And some of the benefits of parliamentarians in a more liberal democracy do brush off on those from a more restricted democracy, and they take those ideas back. And I think, again, we've seen that every time a new parliamentary institution has been created, one of the main endeavors, even if it is subliminal, amongst those parliamentarians in a new assembly, is to actually try to gain more power. We're seeing this in the United Kingdom, where the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, or now the Welsh Senedd, Senate, are ones that are very keen to try to wrest further power from the Westminster government. So democracy is incremental. If you are able to set up a democratic institution, you will find that it actually burgeons. And I think the most important thing about the whole concept of a democracy at a global level is the power of scrutiny. At the moment, states have very little, particularly autocratic states, have very little in the way of scrutiny of their actions. But if you introduce parliamentarians, then their natural instinct is to question and to scrutinize and to monitor the actions of government. And that is a very healthy thing indeed, because there is nothing so cleansing as a ray of sunshine in dark places to expose corruption or to expose misuse of power by governments. Without that form of scrutiny in the form of parliamentarians, then very often that degree of monitoring does not exist. So I think there are many, many different ways in which actually you can find there is a confluence of culture once you get parliamentarians together, even though they may have come from very different background disciplines.
Thanks a lot, Keith. Before I move on to you, James, I just want to say that Camila regrettably cannot stay with us. But if you look on the chat line, she has put her email address and said if anybody wants to contact her by email, please do so. Andreas, I'll go to James first, James, and then Jurdi would like to come back in again. Again, any other questions, please put your electronic hand up or comments. James, over to you. You're muted, James.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry my internet went off because whenever the NATO helicopters hover over the house, they jam the internet. I am right now in Kabul. I think both the presentations of Andreas and Camila were excellent presentation. I would endorse what Andreas said about democracy. Democracy to me is fundamental, and especially for global governance using federalist principles. Democracy at every level of governance, whether it is international, regional, or national, is absolutely important, following the principle of subsidiarity. And of late, especially during COVID, the governments have become very repressive, including some European governments. And there are presidents who keep extending their term, and there are presidents who after elections are not willing to go. And there are some presidents who are wrongly elected. In our own region, I mean, the kinds of violations of human rights that are happening is terrible. India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, to name a few. Many students, journalists, environmentalists, human rights activists, they're all in prison. And many of these governments are violating socio-economic rights, covenants on socio-political rights, and also many other UN conventions. And so-called international community is not raising any voice about suppression of democracy in many of these countries. I mean it's absolutely ridiculous the way democracy is functioning in many of these countries. So therefore, for a world federal government, democracy is absolutely important. And we also need to look at how democracies function within a nation state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Javed, before I invite you, as you've already spoken once, I'm going to ask Daphne Kogu if she'd like to come in first. Daphne.
Good afternoon. It's my first time here in this platform. So I would like to wish you a successful discussion first, and then a great follow-up of this discussion. I'm elected member of the Executive Bureau of the European Union of Federalists. So our president, Sandra, would like to promote cooperation between the UF and the World Federalist Movement first. A few years ago, I come back to Andreas' presentation because I attended 2 years ago, I think, the presentation of Joe Leinen and Andreas in the European Parliament. It was just after the publication of their book. So I would like to focus my question on the new realities after the COVID crisis. And in particular, as a lawyer and specialized on human rights, I would like to see what are the key new challenges. You refer already to the dimension, the media, how we will coordinate actions in order to have more democratic use of the new realities in the media. And then, of course, I will just allow me to refer to the experience we developed the last month after the COVID, or during the COVID situation at the European level. the European Union developed already a kind of very detailed report on rule of law. It's the first time. The report was presented in autumn. In December, we present an action plan on democracy. It's a very ambitious action. But in addition, at the same time, beginning of December, the European Union adopted a new strategy concerning the implementation of EU fundamental rights strategy. So, you know, we have at the EU level, the Charter of Fundamental Rights. It's a very modern instrument. There was reference before to the division between civil and economic rights. Please have a look to the Charter. You will see that all this debate, it's included in the Charter, which is a legally binding instrument for the European Union. And it's really good that now we update the strategy and we try to go ahead and develop also a very strong pillar on social rights. So I would like to see if at global level, we can develop a kind of cooperation based on regional best practice or regional experience. And if this can be seen as a constructive preparatory work towards a more global approach on main issues. Let me, as a last point, mention the excellent work start on the implementation of business and human rights possible, the guiding principle on business and human rights, and the whole debate for more than 5 years now at the Geneva level, at the UN level, concerning a new legally binding, concerning the work of the corporation and how we can include different elements, human rights, labor rights, good governance, transparency, environmental issues, how we can tackle all these new challenges and develop a realistic and very well structured approach, focus on main priorities. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm going to ask Jared, then I'm going to ask Andreas to come back, and then Chris Hammer's hand has gone up. So Jared next.
Thank you again. This will be brief. I'm just following up on both Andreas and Keith's responses. First, Andreas, thank you for your explanation and your arguments for imposing global establishing global democracy by establishing a parliamentarian system in the UN. I still think that is most certainly necessary. And to Keith, I absolutely agree with the fundamental universalistic framework that was established by the human rights, that is the signing and ratification of human rights. My question was more out of concern of whether or not the narrative of nation and nationalism in relation to the modern state will undermine those efforts. That's always the concern. Because as any political scientist and political philosopher knows, the modern state is not the nation, and they often conflict. So, and nation has an incoherent definition essentially, and that's a whole other issue. But nonetheless, we see people trying to organize accordingly. And so I just wanted to follow up that I was wondering if it's possible to establish that universal ethical framework under human rights, and if it's sufficient to weather the nationalistic tendencies of the past few centuries. So
thank you very much, Jared. Andreas, do you want to come in? We've got about 8 minutes left in the session. Do you want to answer that? Then I'm going to ask Chris to make his point and then come back to you again.
Should we hear Chris first, perhaps?
Okay, fine. Chris, over to you. Chris Hammer? You're muted, Chris, I think.
Yes, there we go. Sorry. Yes, thank you just for opportunity to say a few words. We have a transnational working group, as Andreas has mentioned, aiming to, well, campaigning, if you like, for a new community of democracies, a world security community of democratic nations. It would encompass something like 2/3 of the military expenditure of the entire globe. It would be able to guarantee the security of its members against the autocratic threats that we're facing at the moment. And it could be the starting point, following the example of the European Union, which Lucio mentioned earlier. It could expand and grow over time and eventually become our desired world federation. So Andreas and everybody who has emphasized that democracy has to be a basic principle of any world federation. So why not start with the democracies? That's our idea. Andreas has doubts, right, about how it would fit with the UN, how it would be compatible with the UN. That would be a matter for the future. As he says, the end point will only arrive when everybody has become democratic. But this community would be able to encourage that by following the example of Europe again. For instance, it could offer structural adjustment funds to new members to encourage new members to join. Right, so I'd like some comment on that from Andreas. I think that's...
James, is your hand up again, or is it just left up? Is your hand gone up again, or is you just left it up?
No need. Thank you.
Andreas, if you would like to kind of sum the discussion up from your side. One more thing, but as you do, one more question from me is the whole question of definition of democracy. If you could just talk a little bit about that, because I think that's another problem. It's got many meanings around the world.
Right. A lot of things have been raised. Let's start with the last one, which I will try to answer in a very easy way, because as far as democracy promotion is concerned in the international setting, I would start with the minimalistic definition that is provided by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which says that government authority should rest in the will of the people, which emanates from free and fair elections. And we all know democracy is, of course, much more than elections and representation through elections. But that's the minimum that is more or less accepted by international law, even if you like, because it's also, this definition is also included in other instruments that have been ratified by like 140 countries. So to begin with, I would say the very basic definition that is unquestionable is there need to be free and fair elections. The devil will be in the details. What does that mean? But as far as I am concerned, this means multi-party democracy, for instance. So here it already becomes problematic, right? Nonetheless, that's, I think, what we can really refer to. I think one of the interesting lessons, perhaps from the European experience right now, also in connection with this idea of an alliance of democracies, is really how to deal with member states that are backsliding in their democratic standards. I think in terms of Poland and Hungary, there's been a lot of trouble at the EU level because this has not been exactly foreseen, and there haven't been, the exact right instruments, perhaps, to deal with it. Formal instruments, political, of course, they exist politically, but not formally. So this is really one of the big questions in a community of democracies, that especially one that would be include political integration or even include NATO. There's no on-off switch. If you have a militarily integrated system, you cannot just throw out Turkey and then admit it back in at some point. There's an integrated military system, So this is really problematic at the level of detail and needs to be looked at. And it's not necessarily useful to kick out a country if it backslides. So there needs to be a more adjusted and smart way how to deal with it. And I'm not sure this already exists. And even in Europe, I'm not sure about it. Our European Federalist friends might know more and might enlighten us. And Daphne, I really appreciate your comments. And of course, WFM collaboration is something we all for sure appreciate a lot. And we are looking forward to it, I'm sure. In terms of COVID, I have to admit, at this stage, I don't know what the new reality is. It's been disruptive at all levels, the pandemic, but I have some skepticism about what productive will emanate from it. I can see from my perspective, and please, anybody provide more hopeful remarks, but from where I am, what we see is, vaccine nationalism. We see how borders are being shut down. We see how every country tries to implement its own policy. I see little collaboration. I cannot see an independent, impartial investigation into the COVID origins of the COVID pandemic. The WHO investigation that is ongoing, it's a joke. Let's be frank. It's a joke because the Chinese authorities, they could pick who's on the commission. They are actually steering it all and on the spot in Wuhan. What can they see? What can they do? And it's just not something that we would consider an impartial and real investigation that a global parliament would have to provide, for instance. That's one of the reasons where, connecting with what Keith said, why we would need such a global body, because I would expect it to establish a real inquiry into the COVID pandemic, its origins, but also the way how it has been managed by global institutions and national governments. And of course, those two I just mentioned, they don't want that, they don't want that. And that's a basic problem, really. So I don't see something new coming out of it at the level of, global collaboration. And I would hope we would learn more from this. But it has also to do with the question of democracy. China is an autocratic state. And if it was a democracy, there would have been perhaps, alerts coming from there early on. People who were, doctors who were alerting the public about this new virus wouldn't have been shut up and disappeared and so on. So I think global challenges, this is a good example, have a lot to do with democratic governance and accountable governance as well.
Can we begin to wind up now, Andreas, because we're reaching the end. Is that okay?
Yes, one more thought, responding to Jared again. I wouldn't say that nationalism per se is bad. It depends really on how this nationalism is constructed. In political science, there is this idea of inclusive nationalism and exclusive nationalism. As Camila has pointed out, the idea of global citizenship in no way excludes somebody to also identify with a given nation state. Or, it's true, nation states are an illusion, but to this idea, at least, that's been constructed. And inclusive nationalism might take pride in the diversity of a country and its ethnicities and religions and so on. In principle, I wouldn't say nationalism is necessarily bad. It is bad once it becomes exclusive and promotes one specific group as the paramount group that is supposed to rule and is in a position, puts itself into a position to suppress anyone else.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, before I move to the break, I think the Americans call it comfort break for those who need it. May I first of all thank you, Andreas and Camila, very much for what you've said and the way you presented for answering the questions so ably. I think we're all very grateful. Two other very quick points. One is that people will want to support, I'm sure, the UNPA campaign, and we can do so via Andreas and the UNPA website. Also, we are, and it'll be said again, extremely lucky to have Sandra as our new executive director, and I hope all those of you who are not already supporters or members of the World Federalist Movement will go to our website and become a supporter. So thank you very much. We are going to break now.
So welcome back. I hope you all had a good stretching break or a coffee, tea break, whatever you needed. I know some people I think had to leave, and that's fine if you need to go, but thank you again for everyone for spending some of your Saturday with us. We're moving into the second session, which is towards a rules-based world that will focus more on peace and security frameworks in the fight for a world federation. I'm very excited to welcome two panelists from different parts of the world, which I'll introduce them first before I hand it over to Shirine and then to Adil. Shirine Jurdi is the Middle East and North Africa Regional Liaison Officer at the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, or GPAC, which is a close partner of WFM-IGP. She's a dedicated peace builder and advocate for the responsibility to protect, who works on early warning and early responses, women, peace and security, and youth peace and security issues. She also works to promote disarmament mechanisms, such as the Arms Trade Treaty. Shirine's remarks will be followed by Adilur, Rahman, who is a human rights defender, lawyer of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, and the Secretary of Odhikar, which is a member of the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, or CICC. He is a former detainee who has spent 62 days in prison for reporting on extrajudicial killings and is still waiting to face trial. We're very excited to have both of you. We will start our discussion with Shirine, and we'll have sort of a bit of a question and answer format, so a little different from what we did before we open it up to questions for her and then move on to the next panelist. Shirine, I think you are here. I see you, but let me
Hello.
make sure. Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Thanks again for joining us. I think to start, our discussion is going to focus a bit on the responsibility to protect, also specific issues to the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA region, and also delve into, if we have some time, a little bit about women, peace and security. All of these are areas that Shirine works on. To start, so I know that last year, the Responsibility to Protect celebrated 15 years in existence, for those of you who don't know. Could you tell us a little more about what R2P is and why it's still important today, specifically in the MENA region?
Hello everyone. Good evening, good morning. Hello, Angie. Thank you so much for having me here. For me, being a citizen, a peace builder, an ordinary citizen even, I think R2P is something that we look forward to, something that we need to push forward to. So what is R2P? From the name, like it talks about responsibility to protect, which is protection. Protection as defined in the R2P is a protection against genocide and atrocities. It's against genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. The issue of R2P started with a major thing within a new definition of state and state responsibility. So now we know that within the R2P norm that states have not the exclusive the sovereignty of state is not a privilege. The sovereignty of a state is a responsibility, and the state has the responsibility to protect its citizen. According to the R2P, we have to understand and know its pillars for us to understand how to maneuver and how to look forward and how to operationalize the R2P. The first pillar of the R2P is that the state has the responsibility to protect its citizen. The second pillar is that if the state is unable or unwilling to protect its citizens, if the state is unable to protect its citizens, then the international community has the obligation to help the state to be able to protect its citizens. The third pillar is if the state is unable or unwilling to protect its citizens, then the international community has the obligation to step in and help the state in bringing in the protection of the citizens. So this is mainly the protection pillar of R2P. And what is of importance for us to understand and to know is that this protection comes at different layers, where it puts the local, regional, national, and international actors equally responsible for the responsibility of people. Where, for example, like if even like in terms of the regional aspects, like how these regional networks should have embedded the issue of responsibility to protect within their agendas and not to have any kind of crimes, whether tentative to have them on their agendas or not. Within a MENA perspective, as mostly maybe if we have a poll now and we go and to ask, what do you think? Do you think that there are crimes or atrocity crimes in MENA? I bet like the whole list of participants in here would definitely say that there are crimes, there are atrocity crimes. So definitely within a MENA perspective, R2P is a norm that we need to adhere to. We need to keep on having this norm living. And we need also like to bring this norm to be more known to the public opinion, to be more known to the ordinary people, and to be more known in the aspect that if atrocities happens, it's not an intervention with the help of other states. It's actually an obligation that the international community had in 2005 as per the World Summit. We have seen that atrocities, crimes, armed conflicts, continued armed conflicts, conflicts that might erupt or recur in any moment within MENA is something that we are living in. Almost 18% of armed conflicts between 1948 and 2017 were in MENA. 48% of IDPs are in MENA. 57% of international refugees are from MENA. Almost 50% of the international trade of arms is within MENA. This is coupled with feeble and weak states and governments and political systems, with autocratic regimes, with no democratic renewal of our elections, where we have seen in the past few years the ongoing revolutions and protests from country to country, where peaceful protests were unfortunately met with brutality and force measures from governments, which put the individuals at risk and their protection at risk. So this is also coupled with maybe from the grassroots perspective, maybe we have a bit of hate speech, illiteracy rate that is up to 100 million out of the 500 million people within the MENA region. So all these indicators are definitely an alarming factors and indicators. And if we look at the framework of analysis that the R2P has for the before, during, and after the conflict, we see the MENA in general at the brink of having conflicts and having atrocities at different levels. So with a lack of accountability and responsibility by the states, definitely people in MENA need R2P, and still like what is needed from R2P, definitely like R2P is needed within certain maybe points to be put forward to R2P for better operationalization.
And thank you for that overview. I mean, obviously it's a long-standing doctrine, so there's a lot of complexities there involved. I know, I think as many people know in their minds when they think about responsibility to protect, I think it raises for people the issue of the 2011 military intervention in Libya that implicates some questions about the legitimacy of the responsibility to protect. Can you explain a little bit more to us about the use of R2P in Libya and how that does not negate the need for this doctrine or like the practicalities behind it?
Yeah, unfortunately, all what is thought of R2P is the Libyan example. And unfortunately, what is always remembered is how that was actually the third pillar of the R2P that was implemented in Libya. Maybe it was implemented, R2P was implemented in Libya, but it was not the whole R2P that was implemented. Once this military-led UN, NATO-led military intervention in Libya, many things should have been done from a UN perspective. We should have seen, like, was it like a protection of the civilians? I mean, like R2P calls for the protection of people. So after this military intervention, was it a protection of the civilian? Why didn't the UN-led mission and projects go back to pillar one of enabling the Libyan state to regain its right and to protect its people? And this is to say why there was not a building of the institutions in Libya, transitional justice in Libya, and accountability in Libya, to hold those accountable for that and to build on the sovereignty of Libya in a state of sovereignty where responsibility is at the heart. And I think in a way that, unfortunately, the way that what has been done, like the correlation of R2P just within the Libyan case, had devastating impacts on the right of R2P to be implemented in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and where it could have saved millions of lives, millions of atrocities. This is something that we need to look at. One thing also to look here, also within the implementation of R2P within the Libyan case, was it taken according to indicators? This is also a question. It was taken according to the situation. We should have seen also, like, what is the responsibility during the conflict? What kind of indicators raised, and how we could have helped not to have the devastation of the state and the increase of the suffering of the people, which is not the intention of the R2P. These are all points that we need to take into account. We need also to see the framework of analysis, to see like the indicators that are a must once we have the R2P norm being implemented in a certain area.
Thank you for that. And I think for folks who aren't following R2P discourse too much, I think it's really great that we have Shirine with us to talk about it, to get a MENA perspective on it. Oftentimes, I think we hear people talk about R2P in Libya, and they're not even from the region. And so that's, I think, an extra plus. I have one more question to follow up on that discussion. Since you are Lebanese, I think it would be interesting to hear how you see the applicability of R2P in Lebanon. For example, I've seen some really interesting discussions about R2P and the Beirut blast that occurred some months ago, and discussions about whether or not that could even be considered a crime against humanity based on recklessness of the government. It'd be interesting to hear what civil society is doing to push these efforts, and to learn a little bit more about that in Lebanon, which isn't currently conflict affected in the same way that we're looking at some of the other MENA countries.
Yeah, maybe the Lebanese explosion on August 4th became wide known all over the world. Still, what maybe is not known, that for 30 years, Lebanon, after the end of the civil war, we were not able to come to a peaceful or a positive peace. And here we go back to indicators, and we go back to the role of peace builders, and to see what channeling we should have between the peace builders at the grassroots level and the UN agencies, to see what the UN is doing. It's maybe a one channel, whereas we should have two channels, and how the civil society should feed in what the UN should be knowing about indicators of atrocities. The blast maybe was one of the indicators of a failed state, or maybe about the willingness and the ability of the Lebanese state to protect its citizens. We have seen maybe more than 30 assassinations ever since the end of the civil war, not ending until 2 weeks ago with the assassination of an activist, a well-known vocal activist, Rahman. We have seen now, after 6 months of the blast, no proper investigation is being done. 2 days ago, the judge that was assumed to work on this case was put aside. He was stepped down to have a new judge. So we see that the Lebanese state is not serious about investigating the third pillar. So how the international community is able to help the Lebanese state, or like to act in and to help in the Lebanese state. Definitely here we're not talking about military intervention. We're talking about like the third pillar also has the peaceful, non-coercive interventions that it had. Most of the civil society, like now if you go to social media and you see people are talking about we need international intervention in Lebanon to help us, and we need protection from the international community. Whereas what we should be saying, we need the implementation and the commitment of the international community that it had along the R2P lines. And this is definitely not intervention. It's a commitment by the international community to protect citizens while states are not able or unwilling to protect its citizens. I think the R2P, and here like I call the international community, I call the state parties, UN agencies, the international coalition for the R2P. Like we have, if we want to list the indicators along the indicators of the framework of analysis, we see a downfall of accountability. We see that the economic crisis has been increasing. Now minimum wage is less than 200, whereas a rent costs you more than $200. A hyperinflation with more than 200% of hyperinflation. There is an absence of the rule of law, the spread of small arms light weapon, increase in crimes. So if we look down into the indicators, we find that all the indicators of a possible atrocity is there. So it's better within like a peace building approach to work in a preventive lens, This is like to look at the indicators, and this is less costly. It will spare the international community from the veto power that has rendered R2P helpless. And here also is a call to the international community to try, once resolutions are based on R2P, to name it as R2P, and to have this gender agreement that was once raised by the French minister or a diplomat, to spare the R2P from the veto power. This is a responsibility to protect. And now within the COVID, we know what is a human security approach, what is a human rights approach. R2P came maybe as a pioneer, or let's say as a beginner, like in terms of this UN architecture review, if you want to say it, to say that the humanity is at the heart of things. We need to protect humans, and this is something that it's not only for Lebanon and the cases that we are facing, but also the atrocities that are happening in Syria, those after the ISIS, or in Yemen, now what we see in terms of all these atrocities and famine. I would like to end here like with what Secretary General Guterres said in his report to the R2P, that there is a big gap between the commitment of the states to have this commitment to R2P and the position and the need to protect the civilians. One last thing, according also to the new Secretary General's new engagement, the community engagement guideline and the civic spaces participation, I think now it's time to take the work of local peace builders into account, to try to link the local with the global and the regional, to support local peace builders with resources, so that we can enable to have these indicators in a well and properly manner. This is our only way to make R2P survive. It's an only way also like to make also to bring back humanity, just like as humanity was raised after COVID. Thank you, Angie.
Yes, thank you so much for your remarks, Shirine. And I think an important aspect of these peace and security frameworks is understanding both this prevention element that includes coercive and non-coercive measures, which Shirine talked on, and also the accountability element and the need to end impunity when these crimes are not adequately prevented. And I think with that, it's a nice transition into our next panelist discussion, which I understand will focus a little bit more on these accountability issues. Adil, let me hand it over to you. I'm not sure if you're able to use the video. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a little bit late in the day for you as well.
Thank you very much, Anji. Thank you very much for having me here. It's great to be part of this panel. And since we are talking about justice, we always say that no peace is possible without justice. But where do we stand today? Do we have justice established everywhere? SDG 16 talks about access to justice, but we are in a repressive state. There are many authoritarian states where the institutions do not function. I mean, judiciary, law enforcement, totally, gone, dysfunctional. And in our situation, where enforced disappearance is in a full-blown situation, where we have extrajudicial executions, torture to death, attack on human rights defenders, not only in Bangladesh, in my country, also in the region. So where do you stand? You need to look up to the international mechanism. What we have, ICC talks about enforced disappearances. Is there any case so far on enforced disappearance handled by ICC? We are campaigning for that. The issue is that since the war on terror, the authoritarian regimes became the partner of the global actors. The justice has not been the priority. The priority was the attack on dissenting voices, incorporation of the repressive laws in the name of national security laws, the national security syndrome we have seen. And because of that, the people in Asia, Africa, Latin America suffered massively. So why so many people are disappeared in many Latin American countries, in African countries, and in Asia? Because we don't have effective justice mechanism. Because we don't have the mobilization for justice because of the repression. The people are killed, people are disappeared, people are maimed when they raise their voice, when they talk about justice. And that is a challenge. And that is where we are today. And that's why when we talk about ICC, we see that ICC as an avenue, as the institution, as one of the mechanisms which may possibly provide justice to the victims, hundreds and thousands of victims. The families are there waiting for justice. And that is the situation from our side in this situation. If you talk about the kind of mobilization, if you talk about where do we stand for democracy, who talks about democracy? Who talks about mobilization? We need to see it from the other perspective. When in my country, the elections are done at midnight, when all the institutions vote so that the people on the next morning do not need to come to the polling centers. When the EVM, electronic voting machines, only gives one result for one chosen kind of candidate or one party which is in power. When the institutions can do anything with impunity, when the judges take dictation from the top of the regime, you don't have anything else other than people's resistance. You don't have anything else other than people's power. And if that is democratic upsurge, that is democratic upsurge. If that is people's move for justice, that's the people's move for justice to establish something new when everything has collapsed. And there we are today. And that's why we are very much interested to engage, because we know that without alliance, without solidarity, without people's power, we can't move forward. And that's why we were inspired when we have seen the movement of the Black Lives Matter, when we have seen the movement in Algiers, in Beirut, in Hong Kong, now in Myanmar. We have seen the movement of the Indian peasants encircling Delhi. And we are waiting to see the upsurge in Bangladesh too. We are waiting to have a democratic South Asia. And that's why our move for justice is entangled with people's power, with the people's resistance. And that's where we stand today. And it's important to understand, that's why the so-called instrumentalities, the laws, the covenants do not always protect people, because we have hundreds and thousands of laws. We have instruments written in the books, but in practicality, our judges are not the judges who are there to judge. They are there to take dictations from the state, from the authorities. They are there to send people to the torture centers. They are there who will not protect the families, to protect their loved ones from disappearance. And they are there who will not do something when there is extrajudicial execution. So that is the situation here, Anji. So what else I can say?
Thank you for that. That was a very helpful overview, especially for people who maybe are not so familiar with Bangladesh. I have a few follow-up questions, maybe. I think to start, and in thinking about some of the discussions that took place earlier in the day. So, I mean, I know that you were a student leader yourself, or in the fight for democracy and human rights, and in Bangladesh. And of course, this still remains an issue today with many autocratic countries that are in need of democratic reform or of human rights. So the kind of decades later, I mean, I'm wondering if there are some key lessons or takeaways that you see that might be relevant for this movement today, that same fight that's happening in in some of the same countries as before, and also some new countries.
It's interesting. It's always important to remain mobilized. Don't leave the struggle, because it's not that you have got the victory in one struggle and you go home and your rest of your life is fine. It's a constant struggle for justice. Maybe at a local level you succeed, then you go a higher level. In the 1990s, we succeeded to topple down the military dictatorship, but we could not go for a new constitution. The constitution is still there, which is autocratic. And the constitution is providing scopes for autocracy to come in again. So we could not write a democratic constitution. And that's our, I will put it like that, failure after the success of downfall of the General Ershad. So it's important to have people's power established constitutionally, institutionally, and remain vigilant every time. So you have seen where young people came out. If you put it for the Arab Spring in Tunisia, young people came out, that's why there is a success. If you say that in various countries, in Algeria today, because the young people have come out again. In Chile, there has been a success. And if you talk about Black Lives Matter, of course, the election brought success. The result of the election, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, helped a lot. And what is the lesson? When young people are mobilized, when young people across the ethnic, religious, linguistic divisions come out and challenge the status quo, they pave the way to establish justice. They kind of create a situation where a new wave comes out, where a new idea comes out, where a new kind of instrument evolves. And that's why it's important for the young people to take the lead. It's not the old people like us today should be standing every time in front, because we are old enough and we have done when we were young our part of job. So it's their future and it's their world. So if we can't have this world mobilized together, because with that I would like to say that there is always a division between North and South. What is North? There is a North in the North and South in the North. And in the South, there is a North in the South and South in the South. So you must have the alliance South-South against the North-North. And if you can't have that, the global alliance, you can't have a fight for justice. And this fight is essential. This fight is essential because you need to expose the inequalities. You need to expose the repressive laws. You need to expose the detainees, how they are kept. You need to expose the situation of enforced disappearances. You need to expose injustices everywhere. And that's why, as a student activist in late 80s, we tried to do our job. And we were not alone in Bangladesh. Our friends in other countries, other part of the world supported us too.
Thanks for that. I mean, this transnational solidarity movement building is so important. And I think the Black Lives Matter is a really good example of that, where we did see this happen on a global scale, even though it emerged initially in the United States. I think that for us, we're an older leaning bunch. So maybe next time I should ask everyone to make sure they bring at least one person with them to one of these meetings, and we'll double our numbers and our change our mean age, because the youth is very important. And there's some chats happening about that now for those of you who are following along in the Zoom chat. I have one more question before I'll see if there are questions from the audience. I think I mean, you talked a lot about how accountability issues are existing at the national level due to the corruption and other kinds of just systemic, I guess, impunity issues that persist in that region. I think I mentioned this before, but I'm my parents are from that part of the world as well. They're from Sri Lanka. So I have a question that's maybe to talk a little bit more about the International Criminal Court more specifically, and just in an age that's still very kind of hostile towards global institutions. Can you just explain the value and importance of the ICC? I mean, not only for states parties, but for maybe states that are not yet parties, and the people, right? The people within those states who have been victims that are states parties or non-states parties to the ICC.
it's very important to understand what has happened to the Rohingya people. They faced genocide. They are from Myanmar, and they fled to Bangladesh. The ICC is examining this matter. ICC can't go into the details of the genocide issue. They are examining the issue of, these people have left their places. The kind of aggression happened because it's a cross-border issue. And these people are persecuted, came to Bangladesh. ICC is addressing that part of it. It's important because we don't have a mechanism to provide justice to them directly. ICJ is handling the state issue, state level, as long the state accepts that. And if the state doesn't accept, then you can't send forces unless it's accepted by the Security Council and so on. But for ICC, you can pinpoint the persons who are perpetrators. And that is one good thing. The challenge is that Myanmar is not a party. And since Bangladesh is a party, ICC is trying to see this aspect, how best they can handle it. But truly, ICC process is slow. And ICC also suffers from geopolitical issues and not always can handle the issues which are pertinent. But whatever they are doing, that's important. Because when you don't have any other option, you have the ICC option at least. And you have at least this issue like mass atrocity crimes to bring before the ICC. And that's why you need to mobilize, you need to highlight the cases, you need to go for documentation. And documentation is important. And I have no knowledge of any other institution other than ICC at the present global level. UN is there, but UN is for naming and shaming. And the repressive regimes sit there also. Like the UN Human Rights Council, Bangladesh is a member for the 4th time, with all its atrocious kind of activities. But to me, ICC is the only institution, only body, which is still dedicated to provide justice with all its challenges, the challenges I have mentioned. And that's why it's important to assist ICC, to stand with ICC. And that's why from our side in Asia, we campaign for ICC. And we campaigned very strongly. That's why Bangladesh ratified it in 2010, in March 2010. But there are other countries in South Asia which are yet to do that. And they are slow in ratifying because many, as I mentioned earlier, many of the Asian countries are involved in gross human rights violations, and they are worried. They are worried that they will be, their top level perpetrators will be tried. And that's why this is slow, and I think I have answered to your question.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you to both of you for the really interesting remarks. We have about, I think, 10 minutes for some questions and answers from the audience. I saw some questions already appearing in the chat. Perhaps it would be better if they were just made as verbal interventions if you have some time. Andreas, you had a question. I don't know if you want to ask that. I also see James's hand up. So maybe I'll start with James, and for now address the chat ones in the chat unless something else comes up. You have the floor. I can't
You're
hear you.
asking me? I mean,
yes.
My question, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Camila, thank you very much for your presentation. I mean, yes, I do consider ICC as a very important international instrument. But I'm afraid in the case of Afghanistan, though Afghanistan ratified, I mean, it's very good that Bangladesh has ratified and Afghanistan has ratified. Many other countries have not ratified in South Asia. Afghanistan case came up in ICC, and finally the leadership was bulldozed by the US. So the case that they are building against US on Afghanistan was totally dropped, and I felt very sad about it. I mean, how can a world body like ICC give in to US pressures?
If I respond, I will say that it's coming up again, and this has been discussed again. And as campaigners for ICC, I'm optimistic that we will see success soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Dhanyavad.
Are there other questions that anyone would like to pose verbally? If so, raise your hand digitally. Sorry, I haven't been on the responding to the chats too well as I try to from time to time because I was moderating the session. I'll give it a minute, otherwise I have some questions. Okay, so maybe Shirine, if I can go back to you for a moment. I think, so women and girls, we were originally hoping to also discuss a bit about women, peace and security and gender issues. And so I think as everybody knows, women and girls are disproportionately affected by conflict, which is relevant for both the responsibility to protect and also the women, peace and security agenda, which is an agenda that focuses on, justice for gender-based crimes. And also I think more importantly on the increasing the political participation of women in different decision-making processes, which is something I think organizations like ours can also consider when you look at the room and see the gender imbalances that exist. Can you tell us a little bit more about the women, peace and security? This agenda also turned 20 last year, and maybe some of the relevance that it has in your region.
Yeah, definitely. Like it's something that we work on, something that is needed in terms of the marginalization of a large segment of the population. Definitely when we see autocratic regimes, when we see a lack of participation, then we see that there is something missing. And what we have seen in terms of protests, we have seen participation of women calling for prevention of conflict in terms of raising out, as we were talking about justice, raising out to justice and equality between women and men, calling out for their rights. So this kind of protection, or like, let's say a prevention that women are calling for in terms of their rights, is actually feeding in the protection lens, if I may say. And as my colleague here was talking about maybe the youth, which we might say like as the youth peace and security agenda and the women peace and security agenda, I mean, like we need not work in silos. And this is something that also feeds in the SDG 5 and the SDG 16 plus, which is peaceful and inclusive societies. So the women peace and security agenda, maybe, for example, in Lebanon, it was only last year that we had the National Action Plan. We have seen that the participation of women maybe at the formal decision-making level is not as vocal as it should be, as not actually reflecting the presence of women on the ground. But we have seen women in spaces that are maybe non-decision making spaces, but they were the public spaces that women were able to say most of the things that fall within the women peace and security agenda. definitely we need to push forward, and we need also to increase the synergies between the responsibility to protect, even when we talk about the protection pillar within the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and the R2P, because it's directly related into that. And this is why I say it's always important not to work in silos. It's always important to see different agendas that act as a complementary to each other and that help each other in their push towards justice and equality.
Thank you for that. I see a hand from Keith. And please indicate if you have a question for either of the panelists, which one who you're talking to.
Thank you. It was really just a brief statement that, I mean, when we're looking at international justice and the rule of law, there are now increasing norms and standards set out either in treaty or the evolution of customary law or UN resolutions. I mean, the world is almost awash with standards and norms. And the one thing that, of course, is so obvious to us all that we often forget to mention it is the new boy on the block is digital media. It is the power of citizens to mobilize, not just domestically, but internationally in ways, in powerful ways that they've never, ever been able to have before in history. At the click of a button on a mobile phone, you can now gather large numbers of people together for a demonstration, or you can get them to take collective action, whether it is to boycott the goods of a particular firm that is abusing human rights of its workers or something of that nature. And this is an enormously powerful force. And I mean, even in a repressive country like Myanmar, and we have to wait and see what the outcome will be. And I fear and hope that I'm wrong, that it will not be the traditional one of the junta in terms of military repression and bloodshed. But even in a country which is largely isolated and not particularly careful about overall global public opinion, the power of the people there may in itself actually have a profound effect. And if it can work in a country like Myanmar, it's even more effective in one that actually has more democratic institutions and history. So we really need to think about mobilizing the power that people now have through digital communications.
Thank you for that. We have we have 1 minute left before we move into the next session. So I think we'll close this session for now. Thank you again, Shirine and Adil, for your really great interventions. I think it's really important to hear from people who have the actual lived experience of especially when we're talking about issues that are related to the conflict and to peace and security. I don't know if either of you wants to say something for a few seconds before we move on. Otherwise, we'll bring this session to a close.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, great. So for the next session, we'll be discussing environmental justice issues. I'm turning it back over to Peter for that. Peter,
Thank you very much, Angie. Well, if we've been talking today a great deal about a variety of issues of democracy, of justice, of rule of law, and in a sense, it's all about the future of mankind. If anything really sums up one of the big problems we're facing, it is how do we cope with the issue of environmental change, of global warming, of climate change. How are the treaties that we have going to be made effective? What are the crimes that are going to be involved in this environmental change to actually be able to counteract the movement that so many countries at this point have not really, although they've signed up, have not actually instigated the changes that are necessary. How can we play a role in this? And to talk about the issue of environmental justice, again, I'm delighted that we have two immensely qualified speakers, Jojo Mehta and Stephen Hockman. Again, with this session, as before, I'd like to introduce them both and ask them both to speak and then open the floor up for questions. So to begin, welcome Jojo. Jojo co-founded the Stop Ecocide campaign in 2017, alongside barrister and legal pioneer, the late Polly Higgins. Its aim is to support the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court. She is chair of the board of the Stop Ecocide Foundation in the Netherlands, which now manages a campaign, and is convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. And Stephen Hockman, QC, is recognized as one of the leading practitioners in the fields of health and safety law and environmental law in the UK. He was chairman of the General Council of the Bar in 2006 and treasurer of the Middle Temple in 2015. In 2010, Stephen launched the campaign for the creation of an international court for the environment and is the leading authority on the subject. I have had the pleasure of working with him on this, and indeed we've been friends for the last half century. So may I begin by asking Jojo to talk about the Stop Ecocide campaign.
Thank you so much, Peter. What a remarkable company to be in. And I have to say, having been present for the duration of the last session, I feel very humbled to be in this company of people from so many different parts of the world, and where there are so many issues, humanitarian issues, that are seriously being suffered and being addressed. And this issue of ecocide and environmental crime feels like a little bit of a sort of moving into a different space. At the same time, I think that it's becoming increasingly impossible to ignore that destruction of ecosystems. It really is now, if it wasn't before, and probably has already been for decades, amongst the serious crimes that are of most concern to the international community as a whole, which is of course exactly what the definition of the international crimes is under the Rome Statute, which, you know, perhaps makes it very appropriate at this time to be talking about moving ecocide as a crime forward. And I very much look forward to Stephen's contribution shortly afterwards, because I'm actually an enormous fan of the future establishment of an international court for the environment. And one of the aspects of what we're doing is really we see the progressing of a crime of ecocide under the Rome Statute as a sort of stepping stone, as a kind of essential, perhaps a sort of foundational bridge piece that can start to move our sort of dominant global legal system towards one which takes far greater account of what is actually a very, you know, what is reality, the fact that we are deeply interdependent and intertwined with the natural world around us, and that we have spent far too long in our sort of overarching Western global paradigm of considering ourselves the dominant species. And I believe this is based actually in a very long tradition of sort of dualism in our thinking. You know, it goes right back to Plato with the ideal and the real. It goes right through the sort of dominance of the Catholic Church with the spirit versus the body, moves straight on into the Enlightenment with reason versus emotion and nature. You know, we have a very deeply ingrained tendency to separate things and to think of ourselves as separate from the physical and natural world. And so one of the elements, you know, which is more perhaps moral and cultural than it is legal, that we consider very important around taking this crime forward at the international level, is precisely its ability to begin to adjust a little bit that mentality that we have, and move it more towards one where we can actually move away from harming the earth to actually living in harmony with the earth. And I suppose I'd like to just give a very, very brief background to the foundation and campaign, and then just consider a couple of elements. When Polly had been working already for some years on promoting this concept, it was, however, considered at the time quite extreme. And it was difficult to find financial support for the diplomatic work that was beginning at that time. We were already starting to work with small island states and helping them to attend the ICC assembly, which small Pacific islands had never done before. And so with a strong popular following, a grassroots following, and this speaks again to the importance of the mobilization at grassroots level, we were able to raise enough funds to continue that diplomatic work. Now, what we found over the years since then, and what I've been finding increasingly in the nearly 2 years now since Polly sadly departed, is that connection between the grassroots and the political traction of this subject of ecocide has depended actually very strongly on grassroots mobilization. So we would credit the sort of grassroots mobilizations of the last year and a half around climate. So whether that's Extinction Rebellion, whether that's the Sunrise Movement in the US, whether that's the school strikes globally inspired by Greta Thunberg, who's a strong supporter of ours, we believe that these conversations that have opened up the space in the media for discussion around the sort of the extreme nature of the global environmental crisis that we find ourselves in, these movements have opened up the space where the politicians, who we strongly perceive as the laggards in all of this, as compared to the general population or the scientists or even business, who and many aspects of the business world are now starting to say, give us the right rules and we'll move in the right direction. But yeah, so we tend to see the politicians as the laggards. But what we are also seeing very strongly is that where we have a presence on the ground, and we now have campaigns in 12 countries, I believe, campaigns or associate groups. And what we're finding is that wherever we do have that grassroots support and that conversation starts expanding, we also see the political scene start to move and questions starting to be made and contacts starting to be made, so that we're now in a position within the last 14 months, actually, of having gathered recorded recorded interest at the government level from at least 6 states, with parliamentarians from a further dozen states actively interested in the definition that that the panel that we've convened of international criminal lawyers is coming up with at the moment. They're currently in the midst of that drafting process, and we look to see them reporting back in June with a robust definition of ecocide that could potentially be used by interested states to propose at the ICC. And now that's a new state of affairs, in the sense that there have been working definitions in the past, and as many of you may know, the original drafts codes which became the Rome Statute were at one time intended to include serious environmental crime, but didn't make it to the final drafting. And so there have been various definitions around ecocide or serious environmental crime for some time, but to the best of our knowledge, this is the first time that a definition has been sort of worked on in direct response to a request from parliamentarians, in this case from the ruling parties of Sweden, to actually come up with a definition that could fit into the Rome Statute and that could be seriously considered for proposal by interested states. And that does lift the work out of the arena of, shall we say, a lawyer or a group of lawyers having a brainstorm and saying, this is a great idea, let's put this forward, we think it should sound like this, to the ability that we've had in response to this request to convene a really top caliber of lawyers from all around the world to work specifically on something that could be a genuine starting point for moving this agenda forward. So that's a very exciting, sort of position to be in, given where we thought we might be, if you'd have asked us sort of 2 or 3 years ago. And one of the other things that I think it's important to mention is that it's been an interesting, I don't quite know how to put this, perhaps a sort of dot joining exercise, in the sense that when Polly Higgins, who I worked very closely with, became ill, and she suffered a very fast and aggressive cancer, and she died within a few weeks. And the response that we had at the time was very much, her name was very strongly associated with this criminalization of ecocide. And people responded saying, well, what's going to happen to this work if she passes away? And what actually has happened has been remarkable, because when she did depart, actually, I was contacted by a large number of people saying, how can we help you move this forward? And what it made me realize, and where our foundation has evolved to find itself over the intervening time, is kind of at the juxtaposition of a lot of campaigns, lawyers, politicians, and a whole group of, diverse group of interests who were already interested in this area and may already have been working on it. Some of them indeed inspired by Polly herself, who were all too willing to kind of join in with this movement, so that it really has become a movement. And that's been a very amazing thing to sort of to witness. And I think that one of the compelling aspects of taking forward ecocide at the ICC is precisely, and this brings also to mind what one of our previous speakers was saying, is that the ICC does have this international reach, in the sense that, it's actually the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice systems of its members. And so, if one wants to create a coherent law that applies across borders, and that is obviously hugely appropriate when the worst polluters and the perpetrators of environmental destruction are transnational corporations. If one wants to create a rule that actually operates across borders with a certain level of coherence, then it does make sense to do that from the level of the ICC, and particularly given the seriousness now that we perceive environmental destruction to be. And so I think what, this sort of brings us to another aspect of the sort of process, if you like, in terms of bringing forward this crime, that is in a sort of contrast perhaps to some of the other crimes, the other international crimes, which is that, we believe that, ecocide is very much a crime of our time, but also it's a different kind of a crime to, say, war crimes or genocide. And one of the reasons for that is that it's largely, not exclusively, but largely a corporate crime. It's corporate practice that is destroying forests, seabeds, polluting the air, all of these different aspects of environmental destruction. And when it comes to how one is viewed as a person of superior responsibility in a corporation, there is a very different attitude to, for example, perhaps a state actor or somebody who might be leading a coup or potentially committing a war crime. And that is that as a CEO, you care very deeply what your public thinks of you. And so you also, you care very deeply what your investors think of you. And in fact, the very success of your company depends largely on your public image. And so you don't wish to be seen alongside a war criminal or a perpetrator of genocide. That's really not going to do great things for your share price. So there's a way in which potentially a crime of ecocide has the ability to act as a deterrent in a way that is uniquely powerful, we believe. And so that kind of brings into play perhaps a different aspect of the international criminal situation. I really heard very strongly what Shirine was saying about I think it was Shirine, about the ICC being based around the victims, and the possibility of the victims of a crime being the focus of the basis of an institution. And I think I would say that with a crime of ecocide, we could also move into an arena where we're not just looking at, well, not just is the wrong word, we're not only looking at the justice aspect of a rebalance for crimes that have happened. We're looking for a crime to become a ground rule that actually changes the practices on which our economy is based. So that there's a kind of forward-looking aspect to it that has a particular resonance. And I think I'll probably leave my introduction there, but obviously very open to any questions that people may have later in the session.
Thank you so much, Jojo, for a really excellent introduction to the whole issue. I know many of us are fascinated and want to know how we can work closely with that, and none more so, I think, than Stephen and our own concept we've been working on for the International Court on the Environment. So, Stephen, can I pass on to you?
Yes, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. It's a particular pleasure to be speaking alongside Peter Luff. As he said, we've known each other for a very long time. We were at school together, actually. And we bumped into each other again 10 or 12 years ago in the context of a discussion about the idea of a new international environmental court. And Peter has worked with me and has been immensely supportive of that idea. And that has been, it's been a privilege to work with him on this issue. I have to admit that this is my first opportunity to address the World Federalist movement, but I am a huge admirer of the work that you do and a huge supporter of your approaches. And it's also a great pleasure, if I may say so, to speak alongside Jojo. I knew Polly Higgins. We talked about her ideas and we discussed the whole subject quite a few times. She was a great woman and a great campaigner, and we mourned her loss very much, but it's apparent to me that she has a worthy successor in Jojo. I enjoyed very much her presentation, and it's apparent that the campaign to add ecocide, I think this is the objective, as one of the crimes that can be dealt with by the International Criminal Court. That campaign is certainly gathering pace, and that may achieve fruition in the reasonably near future, whereas I fully acknowledge that a campaign for a new international environmental court is, as Jojo herself indicated, probably a slightly longer term proposal. But there is certainly no inconsistency between the two concepts. So let me, in a very few minutes, just introduce the proposal for an international environmental court, and then I'm sure there will be time for some questions and discussions. The starting point, I think, for this is something, an idea with which you will be very familiar, which is that in our society today, we probably have two key problems. They are both problems which are international in scope and which therefore need international solutions. And they are interlinked, the one with the other. One is what you might call an environmental problem, the environmental crisis, which we all face and of which Jojo herself spoke. The other is an economic problem, a problem of inequality, international and in some countries domestic inequality, the problem of economic development, the need for economic development if people's lives are to be made more satisfactory. And one of the biggest difficulties that we face is how to keep these two concepts in balance. How can you achieve a solution to one which is not prejudicial to a solution to the other? Now, this is actually a problem which in individual jurisdictions, the law has been grappling with for a very long time. In our own jurisdiction, for example, we have a concept known as the tort of nuisance, which very much depends on striking the correct balance between the pursuit of economic development on the one hand, through industry, through other similar activity, and the preservation of environmental amenity and the preservation of environmental standards. And so you can see at once that the law, although it's not the only way in which we're going to solve these problems, undoubtedly has a part to play. So that would be my first and very obvious point, which is that in addressing the two major issues that confront us as peoples in the world, the law has a part to play. My second point is that when we talk about the law, we have to appreciate that law comes in at least two forms. One form is what we might call legislation, which can be at a domestic level, laws passed by national parliaments, but at an international level, it can be treaties. Treaties are a form of international legislation, and the United Nations Convention on Climate Change and indeed the Paris Agreement of 2015 are examples of that kind of international legislation. But legislation is not the only kind of law that exists. Another extremely important dimension of the law is case law. Not every country attaches the same importance to case law as we do in the UK, but many do. And certainly at an international level, case law can be extremely important. And it was really this idea that case law, the decisions of judges, the reasons that judges give for their decisions, can have a part to play in advancing the law and thereby in impacting upon public attitudes and public opinion, which was the starting point for my sort of concept of an international environmental court or tribunal. Now, case law, environmental case law on the subject, for example, of climate change, liability for climate change, things of that sort, and the appropriate action taken by domestic governments. I hope everybody's still there. Something slightly strange has happened to my speaker. I expect you're all still there. At a domestic level, there has been a literal proliferation of environmental climate change cases. And one example, Jojo will be familiar, is the famous Urgenda case, which arose in the Netherlands, where I gather you're speaking from, and in which the courts have held that the Dutch government needs to do more and needs to increase the rigor of its approach to climate change. So I was saying that at a domestic level, case law has advanced, but it seems to us, and this is really the nub of our argument, that what we need is a new international judicial institution, an international court for the environment, to develop the principles of liability for transboundary harm on an international basis, and that this would be beneficial both to potential claimants and to potential defendants. Now, the question that you might immediately be asking yourself is, why do we need a new institution? Why, for example, can these issues not be resolved through the International Court of Justice, an institution set up after the Second World War as part of the international settlement which led to the founding of the United Nations? Why doesn't the International Court of Justice deal with these issues? And indeed, in 2015, the very year of the Paris Agreement, the eminent public international lawyer Philippe Sands, who many of you will have heard of, gave a lecture at the Supreme Court in London, in which he suggested precisely that the International Court of Justice would have a role to play. This was in 2015, so nearly 6 years ago now. And he said that international courts and tribunals do play a useful role in developing the law and in contributing to a change of consciousness, and that these developments can catalyze new and needed actions by states, by international organizations, and indeed by the private sector. And he suggested that a statement by a body such as the International Court of Justice as to what is or is not required by the law could contribute to changes in attitudes and behavior which were so urgently needed. And in particular, he said, with all his authority as a distinguished public international lawyer, that it may be that states now have a duty under general international law to act in such a way as to prevent climate change or climate change beyond a particular threshold, and that the International Court of Justice could be asked to confirm that that is the case. Now, the fact is, however, that since Philippe made that striking speech, and I was there to listen to it in the Supreme Court in Parliament Square in London, since Philippe made that striking speech, no such case in the International Court of Justice has taken place. Not even an advisory opinion has been sought on that issue from the International Court of justice, though there has been much discussion about the possibility of seeking an advisory opinion. And so that may suffice to indicate why we ought to be considering the establishment of a new institution. Institutional change, it seemed to me, to match the scale of the problems facing us is the very least that we should be considering. Let me conclude this very brief introductory presentation by giving you a very brief list of the benefits that would flow from the foundation of an international environmental court. And there are 6 of them. I can list them very, very quickly, and then I'll finish, and hopefully we can have a discussion. Number 1, the court could provide a centralized system of dispute settlement that is accessible to a range of actors, including individuals, corporations, and civil society. Secondly, a pool of dedicated scientific experts could assist the judges and arbitrators. Thirdly, the court would strive to clarify legal obligations, harmonize international law relating to the environment, and complement existing regimes, thereby increasing legal certainty and predictability. Fourthly, it could encourage the use of preventative and, where necessary, injunctive measures to minimize ongoing environmental damage. Fifth, it could become the standard compliance and dispute settlement mechanism for environmental treaties. There are more than 500 of these. One example is the UNFCCC, which I mentioned earlier, the Paris Accords, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which have dispute settlement provisions, but no identified and appropriate tribunal for dispute resolution. And sixthly, such a court could help build trust among states, individuals, and the business community through the provision of workable solutions to modern environmental concerns. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both very much indeed. I mean, 2 extraordinarily clear expositions on 2 extremely complicated subjects. That was very good, very, very impressive and start to, we feel very privileged to hear it. I've got a couple of questions, and then I shall move on to everyone else, just reminding you all to put up your electronic hand if you want to ask a question. And my 2 questions, one for Jojo and one for Stephen. Jojo, given that the International Criminal Court tends to focus on individuals and actually holds them criminally responsible, and then can provide for jail sentences, whatever, how would you see prosecution of ecocide under the International Criminal Court? And Stephen, a slightly different question. Before a court comes, an international environmental court comes into force, are there steps before that that could help? For example, getting a group who could give legal definitions of treaties and how they should be interpreted, or even get involved in voluntary arbitration or voluntary negotiations under the issues of the treaties. So if you could possibly each answer that question, Jojo, if you could first.
Thank you. Yes, no, that's a very strong and interesting one. And I think, again, interestingly, with ecocide, we have possibly a slightly different considerations to think about as compared to some of the other atrocity crimes. I think what people often forget about the ICC is, in terms of the sort of general understanding of how the ICC works, is that the ICC is, of course, intended to be a court of last resort. Its whole, existence is based on this idea of complementarity, that the ICC sort of steps in where national jurisdictions, where the criminal justice systems of state members, they're either unwilling or unable to prosecute. Now, as I was mentioning before, with ecocide, because we're looking at a corporate crime on the whole, what we see, I think, with bringing this crime at the ICC and having it ratified by ICC member states is a real broadening of the possibilities and the scopes of prosecution for this. So, I mean, I'll just give you a very sort of pulled from the air example, and this will also show why it's possibly more powerful than people realize, in the sense that, I mean, one of the questions we often get is, but the US isn't a member, China isn't a member, and so on. So let's say, for example, there's a company in the US that is engaging in ecocidal practices in, let's say, Venezuela. I'm just pulling that out of the top of my head. And they have an operational office in Belgium, for example. If Belgium is one of the countries that ratifies this crime, which Belgium's actions so far might indicate it would, then potentially one could prosecute such an actor, such a perpetrator in Belgium. And indeed, I mean, one of the reasons I picked Belgium as an example is that they do have a history of applying principles like universal jurisdiction, where they're willing to potentially deal with crimes that are extrajudicial as far as Belgium's concerned. But that's just an example to sort of show how potentially prosecutions could be carried out in various parts of the world according to ratifying states. Of course, there are certain kinds of actors that would end up potentially being prosecuted by the ICC itself, and a very recent filing, which was spoken about a lot in the media, and I feel was an important one, was that submitted by Chief Rowney of the Brazilian rainforest, with the help of the French lawyer William Bourdon, which was an accusation directly at Jair Bolsonaro. Now, obviously, Brazil is not about to prosecute Jair Bolsonaro for ecocide, but potentially the ICC could, and that would obviously be entirely appropriate. In terms of, you know, a leader of a state. That is the whole point of the ICC, that it's able to step above, you know, the impunity of a head of state within their own jurisdiction. So my sort of key points in answer to that would be that we would actually expect ecocide to be prosecuted in many places other than the ICC, except for in very high profile or, you know, state actor cases such as the Bolsonaro one.
Many thanks. Stephen, do you think there are steps we could take en route towards an international environmental court?
Yes, Peter, I offer two thoughts in response to that question. The first thought is this. I mean, the issue you raise is one that is often raised, and people say, well, you know, isn't this a rather long-term idea, and aren't there things we could do in the meantime? And I admit, frankly, that the concept of an international court for the environment may be some distance away, because it does require an international agreement. All I would say is, in answer to that point, that these things can change very, very quickly, as the need to solve the twin problems that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, environmental and the economic issues facing our planet, that urgent need might lead to institutional change quicker than we thought possible, at any rate, when you and I first started talking about this. But in the meantime, and to give my second and more direct answer to your question, in the meantime, yes, one concept that we've been thinking about is setting up a sort of expert group to give advice on these issues in an authoritative way. And another idea that we've thought about is the setting up of an informal tribunal, which would operate voluntarily, so that people who wanted to get something equivalent to the judgment of an ICE, of an International Court for the Environment, could come to this body and ask for a judgment, and the body would invite interested persons or parties to participate in a hearing, and then it would give a judgment on a voluntary basis, which would not have the force of law, but would nonetheless have an intellectual and a moral impact. So those are two things which, with a degree of time and a degree of resource, neither of which are always readily available, we might consider doing in the meantime.
Many thanks. I can see two hands up, Lucio Levy and then Daphne Kogu. Lucio, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I have appreciated both your interventions. I share the idea that the environmental protection should have the highest priority in the Federalist strategy. the continuation of life on our planet is threatened. So the environmental court should be upheld. But in my view, it is not enough. The UNEP, the environmental institution of the United Nations, is not enough as well. I think that we should propose a world institution, a world organization endowed with the legislative and executive powers, and endowed also with financial resources. The model the European Federalists are thinking at is the European coal and steel community, which was endowed of the four powers I have described above. Friday for Future is a powerful movement which has grown outside of the WFM. And I think that we should join this movement because it has mobilized young people all over the world. And the problem is, what is our contribution to develop this movement? It is easy for us. We should propose some institutional modification, innovations. So we should join the movement and propose a world environmental institution.
Thank you very much, Lucio. Daphne. And can I ask anybody else? Oh, I can see your hand, Guido. Okay, it helps to do the electronic one, but if you can't do it, I can see you and I'll call you after.
I cannot, it doesn't work.
Okay.
It doesn't
I'll call
work.
you after Daphne.
All right.
Daphne, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's really, really time to start working in this ambitious arena. Why? Because it's really the core of the development. But it was mentioned by the two excellent presentations before. It's a corporate crime, and this is the core of the problem. It's linked to the business activity. So I have, from my point of view, we need to develop a kind of holistic view concerning the protection we need. Restoration of the environmental dimension, but also protect the victims, health impact, forced displaced population. So the core of the problem is the civil liability, because there are three different kinds of liability. And for the European perspective, you know that our Commissioner in DG Justice already announced a huge initiative on corporate governance for the first semester of this year, based on the French experience on due diligence law. Why? Because we try to reverse completely the approach and have transparency and prevention mechanisms with mandatory due diligence for all kinds of activities. Probably we have to see if within this process we include very specific elements concerning liability, jurisdiction, complaint mechanism. It's extremely complex, legally speaking, issues, but it's really time to start having a kind of actions, coordinate actions in this area. So we will be very happy to contribute in this effort with, let's say, more specific elements concerning the next step. I have doubts personally concerning the voluntary approach, because we see that all soft approach didn't provide the necessary guarantees for the victims. So there are questions concerning the link between extrajudicial and judicial aspects. So all these elements has to be really seen in a wider perspective. Let me mention again, 10 years after the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles, it's time to start having a more, to develop more specific issues. Why not to start with the environment if there are really already a kind of commitment by big players at the international level to start with very concrete elements on this issue, including also the responsibility of the corporation to find also ways to increase transparency, because in order to introduce a case in Belgium, you need to find all the elements you need in concerning the structure of the companies, how they work with the supply chains. All these issues has to be developed in a more coherent approach, and I think it's urgent to start having a kind of action and to respond to the needs of a more modern, transnational, effective justice system.
Thank you very much. I'll call on Guido and then come back to Jojo and Stephen. Guido.
Sorry for the end, but it doesn't work on my computers. Yes, I like to support this initiative, but I think that you should remember that in international law, you have a distinction between private law and public law. And according to the problem we are dealing with, let me talk about climate change. You see that the problem is a global one, not the problem of some industry, some firm, some individual polluting. Of course, there are the pollution of individual, but you have the big problem, which is mainly political. And in the political system, you have to avoid the phenomenon called free rider. And how you can stop Bolsonaro or Trump and to call them criminal? Of course, they are criminal for an environment point of view. They are criminal, but the problem is that in any case, if you want to solve the climate change problem or biodiversity problem and so on, you need a global approach. A global approach. So the Glasgow conference, I think that you have to find a solution in which you try to avoid the free rider problems. Otherwise, the Glasgow conference will be a defeat, will be a failure. So it is different from a justice problem. That is a political problem, not a justice problem.
I'll come back to Jojo for comments on this.
Hi there. So yeah, there's some interesting things brought up there. And I will take Guido.
We're getting a feedback. Sorry, Jojo, we're getting a feedback. Guido, could you have everyone mute except for Jojo and Stephen?
Is that better?
Much better, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. So yes, I mean, to tackle the climate side first, I mean, it's very interesting in the light of what we're doing, what the drafting panel are looking at is how do you capture climate, and how do you apply some of the criminal law, aspects to that, in terms of causation, attribution, and so on. And that is probably one of the bigger challenges that the drafting panel is facing. But and obviously, we hope to come up with something, by June that is potentially workable, and whether how that interacts with other sort of more treaty type aspects, as Stephen was talking about, the UNFCCC and so on, remains to be seen. However, the interesting thing I think perhaps about, and then this speaks more to what Daphne was saying, is that we need action. We need something that's actually going to start shifting the dial on all of this. And I think this is where the cultural significance of criminalizing serious destruction to ecosystems really comes into play. Because as we all know, there are plenty of environmental laws and there are actually reams of environmental regulations. And of course, when you come to climate litigation, there are now well over 1,300, maybe knocking on 1,500 cases now all around the world, where companies and the governments, as in the Urgenda case or as in the Affaire du siècle, which the result that emerged in France just recently, you know, these are all, they're very important for certain reasons. They're very important for, you know, raising the bar for governments and showing that they need to change their policies and improve their targets and stick to them. So that's one aspect. They're also very important, you know, in the corporate sphere for holding people to account and so on in terms of their public image. And they're very important in terms of bringing together evidence and documentation around all of this. But what all of those cases don't do is change corporate practice. Whereas there is an aspect whereby when you criminalize something and you create individual criminal responsibility, and of course we do that, one of the other things that the drafting panel will be tackling is also that the aspect of supply chains, of course, because you know the biggest actors, they may, you know, they're potentially going to end up saying, well, look, it's actually not us cutting down the forests, it's those guys over there, you know, when everybody knows perfectly well that somewhere along the line it's ended up with this big company. So you know, that's another aspect. But the fact that an individual potentially has to actually face justice themselves actually has a very different effect in the real world. And if you ask people who've prosecuted environmental crimes, they will tell you this, you know, that effectively, you know, and it is possible to do this in certain areas. For example, even in the UK, you know, there are environmental crimes where a director potentially could be held accountable, but often the corporation ends up in that place because, you know, the company will do everything to head it off at the pass, and, you know, to potentially sort of, you know, hide behind the corporate veil and you know, settle a case early so that a single person doesn't end up in the dock. Now, what that shows you is that there is a very powerful sort of moral and deterrent aspect to creating, you know, personal criminal liability at the level of superior decision makers. And so, and what we believe, and I think this will also play into what Stephen Hockman's working on in terms of bringing an international environmental court into play, which I fully believe is going to happen. I believe that once the crime of ecocide is on the table and being discussed, what people will realize and what governments will realize is that this whole arena of environmental crime and environmental regulation and corporate liability is going to become hugely more prominent. And it's actually, you know, it's like, I mean, I suppose I'm tempted to bring in here a contrast between, say, if you're campaigning for human rights, you kind of know that there's this baseline rule that mass torture and killing is just not allowed. But we don't have that in the environmental sphere. You can still go to a government and ask for a permit to drill for oil or ask for a permit to mine or to fish. You know, so at the moment, we still license these things. So, you know, once a certain level of destruction is attributable ultimately to a decision by an individual, yeah, I believe we will start to see quite a strong change in the way people, you know, in the attitudes and the kind of ground rules that people realize they need to operate by. And it may take time for that to percolate, but I do believe it will create quite a strong effect and move us very much more towards the kinds of, you know, the birth of a tribunal or court that like Stephen Hockman's talking about, and much more investigation, reporting, you know, compliance, you know, provision and so on in the whole environmental arena. That's certainly what we're aiming for. Thank
you very much. Stephen, can I ask you to kind of summarize and conclude this session?
That's very kind. Thank you very much, Peter. May I make 2 points? First of all, what I think is important to appreciate, and this is not to disagree with anything that Jojo has said, but just to widen the perspective a little bit, is that in a general sense, and if you like, from a policy perspective, you know, we need to keep environmental protection and economic development in balance, and the trick is going to be how we achieve a balance between those two issues. The second point I'd like to make in conclusion is a legal one, but for me at least, it is an extremely important legal point. If to simplify things, and it is a simplification, but to simplify things, we have a legal system in the world which operates at two and only two levels. We have a system of public international law, which is binding upon states, but generally speaking, and the International Criminal Court might be an exception to this, but generally speaking, doesn't operate in relation to individuals and other people within a domestic system, other actors within a domestic system. And then we have domestic or municipal law operating within individual countries. The unique, I think unique or relatively unique achievement of the European Union has been, and this is one of the reasons why many of us, possibly everyone on this call, wasn't terribly keen on the idea of Brexit. The unique achievement of the European Union was to create an international legal system which actually did drill down into the populations of the individual countries themselves and created a legal regime binding upon individuals generally. And it seems to me that, you know, we need to realize what a huge advance that was when in fact, it was the European Court of Justice, really, in one or two seminal decisions several decades ago, I think, which introduced that concept within the European Union. And to my mind, I'm sort of supplementing or perhaps bringing more into focus a couple of the points that were made, maybe by Lucio and by Guido. To my mind, that recognition and progress towards a universalization of the concept of law embodied in the European Union might be the thing that ultimately we need to aim for.
Well, thank you both enormously for this extremely informative session. It really is enormously important, I think, for the World Federalist Movement to engage with this subject. And I hope we're going to throw what resources we have of people behind both those campaigns to actually get something moving. One thing we're going to be able to do is Stephen and my colleague Anna Canzelas has very kindly done, as you were talking, all of you, a summary, and that will be circulated to everybody. So we'll end this session by thanks again to our two speakers, Jojo Mehta and Stephen Hockman. And I'm going to be working closely with Stephen. I hope also to be able to work with Jojo. And I hope the World Federalist Movement will be part of this progressive move towards dealing with these key issues. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, for those of you who are sitting and have had your video off, we're gonna pick things back up a bit. We're 5 minutes behind schedule, but I think that'll be all right. So thank you again for everyone who's joined. I know some of the panelists and also some of the participants had leave due to other commitments, and also it turning into very late night for folks over in Asia and in East Asia and in Australia. For the final 30 minutes that we're together, so about 25 minutes or so maybe, we're going to have I think a discussion of, a summary of some of the key takeaways from the 3 sessions. And then I think we can have some opportunity to have a bit more of open dialogue. I think some of the panelists might still be with us. If not, we can sort of make a note of those for further learning and further conference opportunities. I saw a lot of engagement, in particular around the environmental justice panel, the one that we just concluded just now, which is great. And this also helps us determine sort of where the interests of our members and our friends are in coming up with future events to keep everyone mobilized. Maybe Peter, if you're able to kind of give some takeaways from the first and the third session.
Actually, can I just have a quick discussion with Anna? Would you like to read out your notes? Because you did some tremendous notes for us. Would that be possible?
Hi, Peter. The notes are quite long, so if it...
Well, go into them and then because they are a very useful summary. Is that okay, Angie? I'll let...
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. May I start, Peter, perhaps by giving my takeaways and then read some of
Absolutely. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, everyone. And it's my first attendance at a WFM meeting. So thank you to Peter and Angie for the introduction. I'm Anna Canzalis, an international environmental lawyer based in London, and it's my privilege to know both Jojo and Stephen, both of whom have been a huge inspiration to me in my own work. So what I took away from the final session, I think NGOs and other actors have for decades worked to achieve environmental justice by enforcing rights and obligations through existing legal frameworks and institutions. And as some of the panelists mentioned, the wave of climate litigation that's sweeping around the world at the moment is a recent example of that kind of approach. And while it's critical that that approach continues to be supported and implemented, I think what we take away from the session that's just gone and from the remarks of Jojo and Stephen is that we also have to be strong advocates for big picture and visionary thinking, because the legal frameworks and institutions we have are quite obviously not adequate to meet the challenges we face as a global society. And indeed, they're facilitating a series of ecological crises that risk irreversibly damaging the natural systems that are required for people and other life on Earth to flourish. So the two proposals discussed this afternoon are quite different. Stephen made the case for a new international court for the environment to be established as a way of addressing issues such as access to justice for affected communities at the international level. Whereas Jojo made the case for the crime of ecocide to be enshrined in international law by amending the Rome Statute, which would be enforced through an existing institution, the International Criminal Court, and Jojo flagged also perhaps before other institutions. What these two proposals have in common, however, I think, is that they seek to address critical gaps and weaknesses in the international system that more and more people are acknowledging exist. And I think both of them are ideas that will continue to resonate and find support because it's increasingly clear that the scale of the crises we face demand these kinds of solutions. So Peter, would you like me to go into any more detail, or will that do for now?
I think that's great for now. That's really helpful. Can I just pick up on something to do with that, but also linking to the other session slightly? And that is, I was reading at the chat lines, which involved John Cowan, John Blasto, Keith, and others, about the role of WFM and how much we might be able to be the organization that brings together different coalitions of NGOs, a kind of centralizing group where NGOs on whatever it is, whether it's nuclear disarmament, whether it's ICE, whether it's ecocide and so on, linked to us as a sort of centralizing body and builds up a momentum that is about global governance. And I thought it was a very useful discussion going on online. I won't go on about it now because I think you probably want to deal with some of the other sessions too, but maybe we could come back to that. Thank you, Anna, by the way.
Yeah, thank you for that great synopsis, and I'll probably be writing to you separately to see if I can get some of your notes. We're going to put together a report, a short report that we'll be sharing after this conference. Apologies to everyone who also attended the October conference. We'll share both of those reports at the same time, so you'll have just an overview of what the discussions were, both in October, but also ones that have just taken place today. Maybe I can go in reverse order, and so I can give some key takeaways about session 2, which was on the rules-based world and peace and security frameworks. Unfortunately, I think both of the panelists had to go. It's a little bit later in the day for them. I think that the takeaway on the discussion that had to do with the responsibility to protect focused on the need for us to consider the non-coercive, the preventative elements that exist under responsibility to protect. There is a lot of discussion and focus on the Pillar 3, which is the one under which the international community would take collective action or use of force type responses, as what we've seen in Libya and what the Security Council is blocking with its veto. But what are the other steps we can take either in advance, using early warning signs and looking at these indicators that Shirine had mentioned quite a bit, and also looking at the role of justice in ending impunity, and also performing a sort of guarantee of non-recurrence in that respect. And that tied in well to the discussion by the other panelists, by Adil, who spoke about the situation in the human rights situation in Bangladesh, particularly highlighting, I think, issues related to disappearances, the lack of justice in many parts of the South Asia and Southeast Asia. He also spoke on the important role of the International Criminal Court in ensuring that there is accountability for people who live, whose national governments are actually their oppressors, and that even in situations where a country is not a state party, there might be some creative avenues to access justice through the ICC anyway. The example being Myanmar. There's a situation at the ICC right now, Bangladesh / Myanmar, and they were able to kind of use a creative approach there in order to get that case to the ICC, since Bangladesh is a state party and Myanmar isn't. We didn't go too much into the technicalities there, but he also highlighted, which I think a lot of us appreciated, the value of people's driven movement and the need to mobilize, and especially to mobilize young people in these fights for human rights, democracy, and justice. For the first session, let me pull up my notes. I don't know if Peter, if you have some takeaways from that one, maybe?
Very little, actually, partly because if we take what Andreas said, I mean, in great detail and very clearly, he talked about the UPA campaign and where it's going, and the concept of democracy, and looked at how one actually can deal with this growing rise of populism and nationalism and so on and so forth. So in a sense, I'd only be summarizing what he said, which everyone would have got. What I did take away from Camila, I thought was very important, was this important of concentrating on youth, on 24% of the world being, I think it's under 25, and how critical it is that we've got to be concentrating to see how we can get people committed and moving towards the future. And again, it brings us back to climate and other things, which are the key issues. And I feel that's something as WFM, we have really got to spend a lot of our time making sure that we can encourage a new generation. And I think Andrew mentioned Daniel and others down in Australia who are doing a great job. And I think we've got to give a lot of support to that, so that it becomes not just a really fascinating discussion and what we're doing, but getting really young activists who see that. I mean, if there has to be one model in the world, it's Greta Thunberg, isn't it? Fantastic work that she's done. And if we can help provide a structure for young people to get involved and then move on so that they start taking the initiative and control of this, I think we'll have done something useful.
And I think some common threads that emerged were this discussion of accountability when there are these grave injustices occurring, the emphasis on the need to involve youth and looking at these kind of youth and grassroots grown movements that have had these impacts at such a global scale. Like those were sort of some of the themes that I heard kind of come out in each of the sessions, which also ties in sort of to what WFM does as an organization that has experience in network building, which came from the comment, and I think Peter, you've also just mentioned there. Those are the kind of what we've identified. I think this would be great to take some time and hear from all of you in your thoughts and how you see this fitting into our work or our future direction. And if you have a comment, raise your hand. Since I know that all is not clear with the world, don't be shy. You can also send us a chat.
Rita's hand has gone up electronically.
Oh, I didn't see it.
No, it did. It went up electronically.
I was able to find the. No, sorry. I want, since you talk about youth and young people, the UF and the World Federalist movement are starting to create an initiative for Glasgow conference. We are discussing about the possibility, but probably Daphne Gogu can say more about that, since Glasgow is in November, but in Italy is involved in the chair of the conference. In Milano in September, at the end of September, where will be a big meeting of young people, so Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and so on, will be there. We think to disseminate a leaflet signed by the World Federalist Movement and the UF and young people. That is the initiative we are talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for. Okay, remember to mute yourself when you're done talking, please. Okay, I see a hand up, Daphne.
So I mentioned already that our presidents for UF, the Union of European Federalists, has sent already a message to the World Federalist Movement proposing the creation of, to start working in a more constructive way and focus our priorities together and set up probably a common structure in order to advance more quicker for certain common defined priorities. At the UF level, we have already adopted last December a declaration calling for common action, setting common structure, if possible a task force, in order to provide, to have a kind of bilateral dialogue and set common defined priorities for the next period. For the UF, the context is very clear. We will have our Congress this summer, so it's good to have something more concrete to present for this summer. And Guido's idea to start developing a kind of cooperation very concrete on priorities, it will be a key issue for us.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, I think that determining these kind of commonalities is very important. I should also say, and in light with a few comments that I've received in the chat, there's a number of questions about Congress, about WFM's Congress and when that will be and how that will be. And so there will be an announcement about that coming soon, likely before Friday, after our board meets. Are there other comments or suggestions or ideas, or maybe even just something that you thought was interesting or you'd like to hear more about? And you can also put that in the chat. Suddenly, a lot of people have raised their hands. I will call on Donna for gender parity purposes. And then I will maybe Nicholas, Stuart, and Jared. Donna, what's yours?
Well, actually, I was going to call on Nicholas. So I will. I know that the Young World Federalists, which Nicholas Rowe is a member of, along with Daniel, have put together a proposal for creating a coalition of MOs and AOs and anyone interested in promoting World Federation. So I think it would be great to hear a little from Nicholas representing that group.
Hi, my name is Nicholas, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Young World Federalists. There's been a lot of talk about young people and engaging young people at this conference, so I thought I might as well say something. Regarding the Coalition for World Federation, that's something we've been working on for a while now, with a number of other World Federalist organizations like Citizens for Global Solutions and Democracy Without Borders, and the World Service Authority and all. And it's one of the reasons why our organization was founded, due to the seeming lack of collaboration and communication between our different organizations. And I'm not really, I'd say if you want to hear more about that, you should talk to Donna or John, because I'm not really keeping up with it right now. But just regarding young people in general, I'm very optimistic about the future of this movement. And I think that ideas like this, like World Federalism, have the potential to bring in thousands, potentially millions of people into this movement, just like ideas, like what Friday for Future is doing, and what the rest of the environmental movement is doing, has brought in millions of young people. Climate change is not going to be solved by a current system of sovereign competing nation states. It requires global governance, and it's an issue that's becoming more and more apparent, and that's going to have a massive impact on the lives of young people. Yeah.
Thank you. Stuart?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so today's the first time I've joined one of these conferences, and I'm still kind of like waiting to see till I get all the notes to understand kind of like what the key takeaways are and what people were expecting to get from this conference. I mean, one of the main things for me is, although we talked specifically about getting more young people involved and how that could work, but I really see that there could be a real benefit from just giving people in general a better idea of what it means to be a global citizen. So rather than, the work will continue to try and build the infrastructure and to try and make the UN more democratic. But I think in the meantime, if we can start building up a global citizen identity, so that people themselves will think, okay, I'm a global citizen, this is what I should expect. And then we can kind of get a driving force from the populations themselves, rather than just waiting for the institutions to be whole and to be as we want them to be. So that's where I was coming from. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to the next meeting.
Thank you. Jared?
Hi, actually building off what Nicholas and Stuart were just saying, I personally, I'm 30 years old, and I learned of world federalism when I was 25, 26 years old. I was introduced to it by James Juncker's book, Beyond Global Governance, Rethinking World Government, etc., and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on World Government. But what is clear is that there is a distinct discrepancy between institutionalized awareness of the World Federalist movement and the grassroots movement, and especially for the youth. And which I'm glad that the organization like Young World Federalists is actually pursuing this effort to establish a grassroots movement, so it's much more widespread and people are much more aware, and especially as was said earlier on in the conference, the 24%, which essentially encapsulates the future of humanity in the latter part of this century. Those generations, especially where anthropogenic climate change is concerned and global governance issues are concerned, those future generations are pivotal in any World Federalist efforts to help with that. So I'm glad to see that the Young World Federalists are really pioneering those efforts, and we definitely need more of that.
Okay, we have Peter and then John. And just so you know, we have 10 more minutes on this call. So depending on how long these comments take, we might not be able to take more questions. We need to set aside just a few minutes for us to do a kind of quick concluding remarks.
I'll be very quick. I mean, the conference for me was fascinating. So many intriguing contributions. But if I could take one thing away from this conference, it came up in the last 2 minutes. I think it was Stuart who said the idea of getting a concept of what world citizenship means and getting that idea out so that people can grasp it and feel part of that concept of global citizenship, I think is the thing I take away more than almost anything from this day's event. So thank you, Stuart, for that, and the other speakers who came out.
John, then Walter. John, you're
muted, John.
I can't hear you. It says that you're not muted, but I can't hear you. Okay, maybe we'll go.
Yeah,
oh,
sorry,
okay, yeah.
My microphone. Yeah, okay, yeah, to Jared, to Stuart, to Peter, to everybody else on this call who wants to get involved actively, get in touch with the Young World Federalists, get in touch with Nick Rowe. They've been on the scene just for a year. It's really exciting. I've been working with them on this idea of how we pull everyone together. We want to do that. We want to reach out to the environmentalists. We want to reach out to the peace movement. So if you're on this call and you want to get involved, look up the Young World Federalists, get in touch, get involved, because we need everybody's help.
Thanks, John. Walter?
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm really glad that we are practicing globalism through this, this worldwide webinar. I'm Walter Dorn. I'm president of the World Federalist Movement Canada. And I thought that by way of introduction, I'd just give a few ideas. Yes, our mantra is that global problems require global solutions, and global solutions require a sense of global citizenship. We in Canada, we're working to strengthen the United Nations, but we also look at institutions beyond it. If we see the League of Nations being the first generation of international organization for peace and solving global problems, then we have the UN as a second generation. We ask ourselves, what would a third generation look like? Would it be a form of world union? What kind of federalism would it be? And how do we have the checks and balances that are necessary to actually create the kind of power that's actually needed to solve today's problems? But we're also looking at things that aren't as theoretical and that are more stepwise. And that is, of course, strengthening the International Criminal Court, creating an individual accountability for actions, not just for the 4 crimes that the ICC covers, but for others, including we've already talked today about environmental crimes, and creating the individual accountability in many other mechanisms, and for disputes and ongoing raging conflicts that require accountability for states which are not party to the ICC. Part of this problem in the ICC, and having worked there, I've seen it firsthand, is that the ICC can have a long list of indictees, but it has a difficulty arresting them. So what kind of international arrest warrants do we need to be able to arrest people who have committed crimes or are wanted by the ICC? International arrest warrants, and finding ways besides Interpol to do red notices and other means of capturing people. Another practical area that we're quite interested in, and I'll end with this, is creating permanent or standing peacekeeping forces. We have a very ad hoc approach from the United Nations where they call upon member states to provide peacekeeping forces for new missions that are being stand up and to promote the rotation of current troops. But it's not an equitable system, and it's also the UN is under-equipped and under-resourced. So what we're looking for is some sort of UN emergency peace service, which can help to provide a very quick response to world conflicts, and that it would cost in the end the world less, because it would have the capacity to respond more quickly. So that's just a few introductory ideas, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue in coming months and years.
Thank you for that, Walter, and thank you for everyone who made your final interventions. I think with about 5 minutes left to go, we'll kind of bring this to a close. I'm happy to see that our second virtual conference has gone very well. I believe the numbers are up, at least the registration numbers. I think we're up. I think the number of participants were up too. And I'm happy to say that we were able to diversify the speakers that we involved. And by that, I mean having some new perspectives being shared with all of you, as well as people from different parts of the world than those we've heard from in the past, in my experience attending these events. There was a link to a survey that was shared in the chat. We'll also be sharing follow-up information afterwards, but it's an evaluation survey. It would be really great if you could fill that out so we could plan our next conference. And later on, I will also be sharing a report that kind of summarizes the panelists and some of the key discussions that were raised in the Q&A and also in this final segment. To bring the whole event to a final close, though, I would like to hand it back over to Sandra to make some final concluding remarks.
It's late here in Africa, so I'm a bit sleepy. Thank you for that, Anji. But I wanted to personally thank all the participants and panelists for the really engaging conversation and the excellent ideas that came forward, and Peter and Anji for such a great moderated session. As everyone may not know, I've been working on a strategy for the future of WFM-IGP. It was good to hear and see the conversation in the chats. Many of the ideas are within that strategic direction. I think what's critical for us moving forward is alignment on how we define ourselves together, the messaging, but also, as everyone mentioned, the mobilization of youth. And also where I'm sitting in Africa, but also engaging the global south, because they see the world very differently and have very different experiences. So collectively, we are strong together, but we do have to really work quite hard and have a coalition of the willing to move the movement forward into the third generation that Walter had just mentioned. The time is now. The world is changing. All the indicators are from the surveys I read are that there is an environment and a willingness to move forward with this idea of federalism. But I think for us, we have a bright future ahead. We have some hard work to do, and I look forward to working with all of you and having your support in doing that. So thank you all for joining today.